second?
Second, I
Motion
second
has
it.
been made and seconded to approve the minutes. Any discussion?
I had one question.
Yep.
On page 9, the first, under the bold heading, vote, talking about the fencing or barrier, says Mr. Moran and Ms. Roth abstained. Is that an abstention or a against?
No, because I wasn't there.
You were there.
About the walkthrough?
No,
Not about the walkthrough?
No.
no, it was,
It's been so long since I wrote that.
no, and I appreciate that. It just sort of jumped out at me that two people would have abstained on that. It was, as I recall it, it was the conversation we had pertaining to the screening of things.
Yep.
And there was a fence, an additional fence was sort of proposed by the applicant at the last minute, so to speak.
But it wasn't erected.
No, nothing had been, it was
No,
just,
yeah.
there was the conversation ensued, and Lowry, Kane, and Ganong voted in favor of the fence and barrier, and just Moran and Roth abstaining. Maybe you did, Susan, and it just jumped out at me as, why
I had
would
to
you have
double-
abstained versus voting against? Does that make sense?
I thought it was related to a site visit and the quality or the density of the barrier
At that time.
Okay.
at that time, so I
Right,
abstained.
because there were,
It was in
There's a
17,
comment
so
by
I wasn't
Marty.
on the board.
If that's the case, then that's fine, it just, I wasn't sure. That was the only, that was the vote of the motion that the criteria had been met.
Yep.
So, that's how I was reading it here.
okay, anything else? Okay, motion's been made and seconded to approve, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And Jens is abstained because he wasn't there. There you go, thank you very much.
Could I just, mention one thing in here?
No?
Well, we can do, minor things, like council is spelled with it.
Sorry.
Yep, with a C. I ignore
Oh,
spelling,
check.
I'm so used to seeing it.
No,
I
geez,
know.
I'm the wrong
Jeez.
one.
That was devastating, comment,
I
right?
saw council today with 2 S's, which I thought, on a law office, on their sign.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting.
It's in Sanford, what do you want?
Because what it is. The S is a
No
prevalent.
camera.
No, we
That's
have
right.
a camera.
It's just taking a minute.
Huh?
We have a camera, it's running over here, it's,
Oh, there it is.
Lovely.
it's a stealth camera.
Okay, so
Different
I'll
spot.
call this meeting of the Planning Board Comprehensive Plan Revision Committee to order at 7:06,
Gonna
January
close-
31st.
Gonna close it.
Yes, and we closed the other meeting.
Okay.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Murray,
Thank you much, Marty.
good luck.
So we have an approval of the minutes, determination of home occupation categories in the R1, proposed conditional uses in the R1, and a discussion of the farm overlay district. which we will get to. Anybody have any questions on the minutes from 2 weeks ago? Any changes that need to be made?
I just saw one, just the one spelling, the name spelling, 3rd paragraph, 2nd page.
Yeah.
Didn't even notice that, thank you.
Is there anything else that needs to be correct? I suppose we should do it formally and approve the minutes.
Make a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
Is there-
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to approve the minutes. Any other discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions? Good. Oh, Jamie,
Wasn't here.
so yeah,
Well, I was here either.
so then it is 7-2, 6-2. 7-2.
That seems right.
Correct.
And, Okay. Determination of the home occupation categories in the R1, R2. Are we going to have both type 1 and type 2 in the R1? And if we are, let's put it to bed, quit going back and beating it with a dead horse. Because it's getting really tiresome to pick up that dead horse.
Can you just, briefly recap what a type two
A type 2 was anything that was not type 1. It could have up to 2 employees. If you remember correctly, the type 1 has no sign, no employees, will not have clients coming in and going back and forth and generally running the risk of being disruptive. Type 2, on the other hand, is a little more lenient. It's a conditional use.
That was the thing that I had proposed, that kind of sums up what you're describing.
And we need to, the next step will be to look at it and say, you know, what conditional uses will be allowed, and they would be in a type 2 home occupation.
Type two requires the town
It requires conditional use, which means they have to come
Have to
before the
go
planning board.
permit. Or don't they have to get a permit? Is that,
No, if it's a conditional use, they have to come before the planning board, because we're the ones who issue conditional use permits.
Unless it's of such scale that it goes to staff review.
that was.
That's true.
but it doesn't
Could go.
require a permit on top of that?
Requires-
It does
That's what
require a
requires a
permit,
permit,
but it's all based on scale as to whether or not they come see the planning board.
okay.
Well, that was one of the things that we had, when we left the discussion, we had a few hanging questions. That language is not included in what we were looking at, but at the bottom, after I revised it after our meeting, I had type 2 items to be discussed further, registration with the town, a 2-step approach, step 1, staff review, step 2, planning board, depending upon the number of employees. Item number 7, number of vehicle trips per day, item number 8, additional parking spaces, and then types of uses. So we have a few
Right, we've got a few things that we have
loose
to tie.
threads to tie.
And this is solely focused in the
R1.
R1?
In the R1. We may
Right.
adopt home occupations the way they are to cover all districts.
Right,
For
but for right now.
us, right now,
Yeah.
we're looking at the R1.
If I can make a suggestion, if we can nail the uses down first and then work backwards, because depending upon what uses we think are appropriate for this, that would dictate number of vehicle trips per day, parking spaces, as opposed to just kind of flying blind and going in the other direction.
And this refers to what type of home occupation?
The type 2.
The type two.
Type 1, we're not even gonna know about.
Okay, so we,
They're out there, there's no signs, they're not generating any kind of, that's, you know, mom and pop with their quilt shop, or the guy who lives next door to me with his little chicken coop stand out front selling eggs for $3 a dozen. Okay,
so that's done, R1
that's
is done.
type 1.
Type 1, okay, so now we're on to 2.
And now we're looking at type 2, and that became the discussion, well, what's allowed, what's not allowed? Tad has come up with a list of the existing businesses that we have in there right now, so we'll look at that and we'll continue on. But I think the main question is, do we wanna have type 2 in the R1? If you think that we should have type 2 businesses in the R1, we'll proceed forward. If you think that all we should have is type 1 in the R1, then there's no reason to go forward with defining type 2 as it relates to R1.
So the product of Tad's research, are all of these ostensibly potential home occupation 2 candidates? Or no, only
Well,
some of them,
actually,
right?
a lot of these got permits. A lot of these got permits. Mazzy Peck got a permit, Dutch Elm has been there forever. Mary May Stables was there, could find no permits on that. LeBlanc Carpentry, which is an interesting one, that was part of the exemption. The current exemption that exists, it says if you're a contractor and you don't have more than 1 truck, 2 trucks, and they're all single axle, you know, you have two axles and so forth, and your employees don't meet, and you don't store material on site, you don't have to come and get a permit, it's basically makes it a type one. But the problem is, in that particular case, they have employees moving in, and they do keep material on site, so they've exceeded the limits of that exemption that they've got. But they were exempt, so that was a home occupation, you wanna say, it wasn't even a home occupation, it was an exempt occupation, so in a sense, it would be a type one, that would be a type one right there. But we're eliminating that, we said no contractor yards in the R one, or district, so that really doesn't count. Old Talbot Farm, that's Mark Panett, and that's now, that deals with the issue of farms. The daycare, I couldn't find permits on that, that might have been a home occupation, but it's a daycare, home daycare, which means 6 or less kids. Welch and Sons, no, that started off as a gravel pit and then morphed into contractor yard two, which we gave him designation back in 2016, I believe.
Right, and you did,
And he qualified for the R2, or excuse me, the contractor yard two. So that was a permitted use. Dragonfly's been an agricultural use, and you tell me how long it's been there, they've never, of course, had permits, agriculture is permitted in the R1 district. So Pam Drew's llama farm was approved by the planning board. Crossroads, Shady Oaks, obviously, those received planning board approvals. Joyce Spencer, that's just a log yard that comes back and, comes in and out based on the season, they do log and camp firewood stuff. They don't have permits, they do that. And then Dewston Maple and Honey is an agricultural use, we've never had to permit that either. Eagle Oil, which is interesting because it's a spot zone. It's right in the middle of, it's right in the middle of the BI district, and then this address is Fritz Lane. So it's completely isolated from our R1 districts, it's a spot zone that they wanted, and he operates a fuel storage facility out of there, which is really not permitted.
Is that the gentleman that came that said he was Fritz's new neighbor to that meeting?
No,
Was that somebody else?
No, it's Ellen, Ellen is his, I believe it's his adopted. So,
That's what
I think it's stepson.
Stepson, yeah.
I think it's stepson, yeah. So,
Okay.
So,
that's kind of like an aberration from the whole facility, because it's not even linked to the R1, and they're eventually gonna wanna get out of that R1 designation, because it's not advantageous to them.
How far down Mountain Road does R1 go?
It's right down Mountain
Does it
Road.
go all the way to the end in a row?
It goes a little bit over the Oliver Farm.
Okay.
The Oliver Farm, Maryland's, it's a little into that, where it starts to rise up. If you go down Mountain Road, it goes down and then rises back up. It's in that rise there, that the district boundary goes through there.
Okay. I was
No
just
idea
curious, because I
why.
know that there's
That's
some
where it
business
is.
on the other side,
Yeah.
and they weren't on the list. There's an alpaca farm down there, raises really good alpacas, they taste nice. Well, they had an open house, and they went down and they were selling alpaca burgers.
I didn't know you ate them.
What?
Don't know why not.
I don't either, it's just, I thought it was, maybe like a raw bowl, in India. Don't touch the cow, don't touch the llama.
Holy cow.
So,
It can only get worse.
It couldn't get better, that's.
can I make a suggestion if we decide about the R2? I mean, I'm thinking, the type 2 in the R1 district, I'm getting confused with all my terminology here, is that, I'm thinking that we should have a second designation, and that rather than specifying particular occupations or pursuits, that we make it more qualitative, and so that there were certain criteria in terms for different types of occupations, like how much land, or, noise, or, debris, or odor.
Home occupations, you're not supposed to have any of that.
Well, but the one I could think of would be trip generation.
Trip
That's if,
generation's
you know,
big
if
for
you're
them.
in an R1 area, you know, a onerous amount of trips coming in and out.
And that creates noise.
Right.
and-
And, you know, the one thing that the code enforcement officer and I had discussed before, I mean, he's adamant, doctor offices, no. Dentist offices, no, too much traffic. And then it changes the character of the residential building.
But-
It's not residential anymore.
So like what Jamie just said, if we make it sort of qualitative, instead of quantifying it so specifically, then right now you came up with trip generations, but who's to say in 6 weeks, somebody's not gonna do something creative that we wish that we had thought of at the meeting, and because we didn't specify it in our list, that we left ourselves some wiggle room to.
You mean a specific list of
Yes,
types
I
of
think it,
businesses?
I think it shouldn't be listed necessarily. We can exclude certain types of businesses, but rather than getting a list of 100 different possible pursuits.
I don't think that's what you're suggesting,
No.
Don, are you? We can't do that. I mean, you wanna get back to a definition of what type two is based upon the activities, but we've gotta get a definition, period.
Right.
We can't list out business.
Right.
No, we're
No.
not
I-
going
The
to-
ordinance would be 100 pages long.
I understand, the last
I-
meeting we had was talking about, soap making, boat making, honey making,
Yeah, those
and
are
all kinds of.
all the type one things
Right,
that would be
but
invisible,
there were
but I
type
agree with
things,
you.
yeah.
Making a list of what can be there is going to be eliminating something that we can't think of,
Right.
and that's fruitless.
But I think that problem
Perhaps,
is easily solved by having a designate, category that says, and other businesses that the planning board deems are compatible with the neighborhood. Yeah, my concern is that you come along and you say,
You can't do that.
okay,
No. You can't do that.
We like the concept, the attorneys involved don't.
it troubles me because somebody's gonna come along and say, well, it doesn't say that I can't, so I should be able to put a marijuana farm in that district.
If it's not permitted, you can't.
But if it's not listed
If it's not
as a
listed-
permit,
That's why we don't,
permitted
you
use,
don't,
that's what we're
you don't want
saying.
any list, you wanna define what a type two
I
is based upon its
agree.
character, period. And then if you wanna put e.g. for example,
yes.
that's fine, but you can't.
Well, I mean, the things that we looked at last time had to do with trip generation,
Agreed.
and if we can keep that number to a relatively small one. And there's also the caveat that, you're not gonna change the nature of the neighborhood. So that will also eliminate a number of possibilities.
And that's the planning, that'll be the planning board's job in the conditional use application process,
Okay.
to figure all that out, and put appropriate conditions on whatever somebody wants to do, based upon the standards you guys adopt.
I'm fine with
In
that.
other words, you just hit the ball back in your court.
That's the way she works.
I'm fine with that, it concerns me, because at one point, we looked at, if you remember what the ordinance says, anything that is not specifically allowed is expressly prohibited. So if we don't say that you can do that, then you can't.
Well, there's a problem with that statement in general. I mean,
That's what the ordinance says.
and it shouldn't.
Yes, it should.
I mean, if you're white, those things.
One of the things that struck me about this list is that most of these things that are there are actually farm related, to use a generic term. They're not what we have been thinking of as home occupations. And the other thing that I did, because I looked at the list and I see the pattern that Tad used, but I looked at the acreage. So, based upon the acreage, I knew you would have been disappointed. I had a bunch to go in that direction and a bunch to go the other way, and we'll meet somewhere in the middle. But I found that the acreage breakdown was rather on the interesting side. Because of all 14 that were listed, there are only 2 that are on 1 acre. And then we go to another group between, well, greater than 1 but less than 10. and then another group of between 10 and less than 20, and then 20 up to less than 50, and then 100 and way over 100. So R1 is a very mixed bag in terms of the size of the lots. And I still think that that's something that we should be taking into account when we talk about what is allowed and what is not allowed. And I think, to some extent, the position, and this again would be a planning board thing, if you have a large lot in between a couple of other large lots, and you generate, X number of trips a day, that would be far less noticeable to your neighbors than if you are a large lot surrounded by a lot of little lots.
And I don't think that we can say, if you're in the R1, if you've got 20 acres, and you've got 20 acres, and you've got 20 acres, well, you can generate more trips because you've got 20 acres. Trip generation is a function of a business, not a function of the acreage.
No, I understand that. But what I'm saying is that in that particular section of R1, if you have all large lots, that perhaps whatever your business is that is generating those trips, it would be less of an impact on the neighbors than if you have a house and a house and a house and a house and a house. And I don't know that that's a solvable problem, I just threw that out there.
I don't think that it is solvable. I think if we're going to say that on a type 2, you can have a type 2 home occupation with X number of trips. I don't think we can say you can have X number of trips, however, if you have a bigger lot, you can have more.
No, I agree with you.
So I think we need to define the X number of trips.
Is there a
I kind
minimum
of
lot
like-
size for the type 2?
Minimum lot size in your district,
Is,
which is.
is a minimum, yeah, it's a
Right,
1
is an
acre.
acre, but if you go to the second designation, can you then
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
require more land in order to a lot of, say, 3 acres or 5 acres or 10 acres? I don't know, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but can you change the requirement for the amount, the size of the lot when you move from a discrete home occupation to something that's more impactful, perhaps, to
The
the
problem is
neighbors?
that in home occupations, the limiting factor is not the lot size, it's the size of the residence.
It's 1,000 feet maximum, square feet.
1,000 square foot maximum, and it's 25% of the floor area of the residence, which means in order to have 1,000, you have to have a 4,000 square foot building. Livable 4,000 square foot.
But it
facility.
might influence the type of occupation. I think that's what you were getting at, wasn't it, to some extent?
Well, it might define the type of operation, and also I was wondering whether or not you could define it by the amount of property it has to have, but if it's an acre lot, then the answer
Yes,
is
yeah,
no.
I don't think defining it by the amount of acreage would make any difference. I've got 6.5 acres of land, I've got an 1,800 square foot house. Doesn't matter that I've got 6.5 acres and I could do all kinds of stuff. I've got an 1,800 square foot house. I'm restricted to 450 square feet for an office.
But you could expand your house on 6 acres,
I could.
where you probably might not be able to on a 1 acre lot because of setbacks.
Is it,
I could.
But that's still driven by the house and not by the
Right.
acreage.
Yeah, it's all driven by the size of the house.
It's a home occupation, and the way it's usually written in most ordinances, and actually glad ours doesn't say this, it says, it's a use that's traditionally done in the home. That's how many ordinances have it. It's always supposed to be something that does not alter the residential character or feel of the neighborhood. Either the residential appearance of the house or the residential character of the house and the neighborhood. It's supposed to be very low impact. That's why it gets problematic when you get into doctor's offices, which have support staff, which require a lot of parking, which have constant turnover.
I would object to like a doctor or dentist's office also, just on the fact of some of the chemicals that are used in that
Absolutely.
occupation that you wouldn't
Absolutely.
want on a septic system probably, you know.
Or some of the people that can visit.
You know.
I think I kind of like the idea that you had about, not having a list, what are we gonna use for criteria? You can have a maximum of 2 employees, you can only generate a certain number of trips, and that becomes type 2, and then you have to go to staff review or to the planning board to determine the specific business that would be allowed. I think that would make it
Simple.
easier and make it simple.
Might wanna add, you could add something that, you know, don't use any hazardous materials or something that would make it so that, well, I guess part of my concern is, like, even with doctors and dentists, some of the stuff that gets brought in, the gases and the stuff like that. Because they're very flammable. And they're bringing them in big trucks, because that's how they replace them. So, I don't know how to quite get around that, because I think we wanna make sure that if we do type 2, that we have type 2s that fit.
And that's where having specific criteria for the trip generation, the fact that you're limited to on the size of the property that you can have, the square footage that can be used, the number of employees, those things would automatically build in a restriction for
Okay.
somebody like a dentist or a doctor.
Well, if we start on the basis of the fact that we've got a maximum of 2 non-resident employees and 1,000 square foot size limitation, then the next piece is what's a reasonable number of trips in a residential neighborhood? You know, how many per day?
If memory serves me, a typical residential household, the average is about 10.
So I teach.
So that's dedicated to the resident.
Right, I understand.
So, I mean,
If you bring in 2 employees, you're gonna add 4 trips
right.
a day.
I mean, my family with 3 drivers and busy schedules, we'll blow through 10 trips by noon, you know?
I only have 1 kid.
So, you know, I don't see, up to an additional, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20 trips for, 20 might be on the high end. An additional 10 trips dedicated to the business, you know? I mean, ultimately, unless you're really got people going in and out of there all times, you know, 20 trips a day, is not gonna generate a lot of complaints.
Yeah.
Unless somebody's looking to complain about you for some reason.
Yeah, and 20 would work for me. How do the rest of you feel? Is 20 a good number? Or do you think it's higher or lower? Chip?
Is it okay if I make a couple of comments about the, one specifically related to this, which
Okay.
is deliveries, which I suggest be included in trips, but that might make you wanna add, I don't know, 5 more.
And if you're getting 5 deliveries, or 2 or 3 deliveries a day, you're getting up to the point where you need to seriously think about moving your business someplace
Right.
else. That's a lot of,
Okay,
a lot of
just
delivery.
a suggestion, then I had another just thought, which is, the 2 things are connected. Are there things that, rather than having a list of things that are permitted, is it prudent to come up with a list of things that you already think should not be allowed, which might fit in the criteria? And related to that question is, if a business type is not explicitly prohibited, we have this generic, you're limited by square footage, limited by the number of employees, you're limited by the number of trips. If someone comes in and meets those 3 criteria, is the planning board required to grant a permit?
It's a conditional use permit, and you meet the criteria? Yes.
But I thought the answer was, which is why I mean, I don't know if doctor's office, dentist's office, psychiatrist, I mean, you can have different kinds of physicians. You might have someone who's a psychiatrist, and
Right.
maybe everybody thinks that's okay, but somebody thinks there could be mission creep there.
And can
Couple
you
thoughts.
leave an option for some level of subjectivity or discretion? Or it's just so black and white, it's either you need it or you don't? So you've gotta cover
And
yourself.
I think, that's a tough criteria. There are times when we have to say, no, you don't meet the criteria, or yes, you do. You know, if we say to somebody, here, we're gonna allow you 20 trips a day, and you say, well, I need to have 30, well, no, I'm sorry, it's 20 trips a day. You know, that's the extent of what you're gonna be allowed to have.
That would limit most of your physicians, dentists, psychiatrists.
That's gonna limit a lot of businesses that have two
Yeah.
people working for them.
I think we can come up with one or two other definitions that are vague enough to leave you some wiggle room to deny someone who you really feel perhaps can meet most of the criteria, but you wanna leave yourself a space so that you have some discretion. Is that possible?
Yeah, you know, we could come up with something along those lines from the planning board point of view, but for the purposes of saying, you know, we're gonna have type 2, we're looking at 2 employees, 20 trips.
The 20 trips, you're talking regarding the business, not just including the family, right?
Including the family, it includes
Then I
everybody.
would think, because you got 40 written down here, I don't know that,
Oh, no,
if you've got, if you've
40
got
is not
10 for
40
the
was in
family,
the original.
right, but if you assume 10 for the family, you're only adding 10 for the business.
Well, yes, that was the number that Jane, I would have said 25, so you'd have 15, but again, if you had 2 employees,
That's what it is.
that's 4 trips.
Okay, for those of us that are kind of a little bit on the late, what is defined as a trip? Is
In
it,
and out,
okay,
In
that's
or
one
out.
trip.
in or out.
In or out.
In or out,
You-
it's one
Okay.
trip.
So if you go to
When
work, it's
you came
one,
here,
if
when
you
you
go
came
home,
here
that's
tonight, you're
2.
gonna do 2 trips,
Okay.
out and back into your house.
If what we're trying to get at here, I mean, home occupation, something's happening in your home. So by limiting the number of trips, you're limiting the number of clients, if that's the case.
Mhm.
You're also limiting the number of deliveries, you're limiting all of those things. And that in itself should limit some of the types.
Correct.
So that, I mean, medical offices are pretty much out of the question. I would think that an accountant or a lawyer's office would also be out of the question.
Well,
Well, maybe
unless
not a lawyer,
it's a
but-
sole practitioner, I
Yeah.
think it probably would be.
But I like what Diane said in terms of, and Chip said as well, in terms of defining things that are excluded. So for instance, toxic or noxious gases or chemicals or
Right, and we can,
noise,
but we can put that
and
into the
that's
type
what,
2 and say
that
that
would
that's.
go into further, another definition, another
No.
category.
I don't think it would, I think we could simply, list in the type 2 that, you know, there will be, no chemicals or, dangerous gases.
Then you can't have a sculptor,
Doesn't,
you can't have,
That's
you
true.
can't have an automotive, one of the things that we've seen is an automotive repair facility in the home.
Doesn't getting
That
a
happens.
permit from the town automatically kick in, that's code, safety code,
Life safety codes.
code.
Life safety codes kick in whether you have a permit or not. Your-
Doesn't that take into consideration what we're talking about as far as chemicals, electrical wiring?
No, because you can put up, if you put, what is it, 1/4 of an inch thick drywall,
No,
Oh.
it's more, it's 5/8 size.
5/8 of an inch
Fire
of
separation
drywall,
to our-
you have fire suppression enough to allow somebody to get out. So even if there's a dangerous chemical in there, theoretically, the 5/8 inch wall will allow people to get out. It's not designed to stop the fire, it's designed to allow people to get out of the building once they realize there is a fire.
In addition to auto, you got woodworkers who are gonna be spraying.
Absolutely, woodworkers.
Like varnishing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those are not pleasant
And I
chemicals.
don't think the intent is to restrict that, so that's where there's
There's a danger, yeah.
there's a
if you
fine
just-
line on how do you,
Because everybody uses chemicals of some sort, some
Yeah.
sort of noxious chemical, when you clean, you use them.
Right.
I was just gonna say, bleach,
Yeah.
Yeah.
ammonia.
And so,
But you
you
could
know,
do what I
certain,
did.
certainly.
Through some ammonia, no, it's
You know?
through some ammonia.
Nobody
into
uses
chlorine.
more chemicals than a golf
Oh,
course.
no.
Three-story tenement in Chicago.
But again, this is home.
This is home occupation, and, you know, I think, you know, 20 might be a little on the low side, I think 25 might work better, because it would give you, at 20, when we work out the number of other trips that are available, you're talking about, on a good day, you might get 3 clients coming in.
Well, you can't do 25, you have to do 26, because otherwise somebody gets
Somebody
stuck there.
gets-
Yeah.
And they can't drive out till the next day.
So are we presuming that we are gonna have a second category, or,
If we're gonna have one, we need to make that
so
decision.
Mr.
So let's make
Ganley,
that
do you
decision.
have a thought on whether or not it's too restrictive to only have one category?
I think it's too restrictive, because I think we can control it with an appropriate definition, and then I think the planning board needs to, dealing with things like odors and noise, et cetera, ought to have some regulations in place that somebody ought to know about, and see that they meet those regulations. So that's where your I don't wanna say
That's where the-
discretion,
right.
Okay,
That gives you the wiggle, I agree with Tom.
okay, so are we agreed that we should have two types?
Yes.
Anybody disagree with that? Anybody other?
you do.
Yeah, other than me, nobody disagree with that. Okay,
There it is, yeah.
okay, then fine, we'll have 2 types.
I think
I
that,
think we probably
I think
already
we're already
do,
on
we
it,
just
so
don't know it.
I think that
Oh, yeah.
traffic control is gonna be so hard to police.
Yep.
What are the other 2 that we're talking about, because that's gonna be a really tough one to ever,
We're looking at, you're limited to 2 employees, you get a maximum of 25% up to 1,000 square feet. 25 trips per day.
24.
Why don't we make it 30
I'd say
and call it
30.
a day? We'll split the baby between 20 and 40.
No, 30's pretty intense, guys.
Getting up there.
That's
fair
really,
amount.
that's,
So
That's
20.
really
We're
only
gonna do
15.
Sammy, how many
So
is
say
that?
20.
you have 30
Well,
trips
that's
going in
15
on
round
you.
trips
That's
in a
only
day.
15 round
Right.
trips.
I mean,
That's 2 clients an hour,
You can do
that's
that
every
with
half
the-
hour you have somebody
Right.
going in and out,
Yeah.
that's a lot of traffic.
Well, but it could all happen at one point, you know.
And then it's even worse than a lot of
I'm
traffic.
just telling you, sometimes,
Right, but
Two
if you
dozen
have,
clusters.
say you have a house
Yeah,
with
that's
2
what my
people
thought
and a
was.
kid that drives,
I've got 4 kids that drive, and I'm just saying, if you can just
You're done
see
by
the
9 o'clock in the
traffic
morning.
coming out of my driveway, that's a really tough one to police. I don't think you're wrong in saying 30, and I don't think that's hard, I didn't.
But not all families have
But
it. If
you-
you have
yeah.
a full
And it
house,
would
you're
have to be
probably not
really
gonna have the
egregious
room
if
to
somebody was
generate that
really
kind of
violating
traffic.
But
And see-
even if that were, you don't have a business working out of your house, so it doesn't matter.
I do have a home,
and
I
it
do
won't,
have a
it wouldn't be an issue
But
unless the
why?
traffic was so much that somebody complained.
correct.
Right.
That's what she
and
does.
And that's
And that's
ultimately
why
gonna
the
be the
restriction-
police.
So that if
egregious.
somebody does complain and somebody gets out of hand,
Right.
there's something there to be able to say.
Yep.
But
You can
if
go
they're,
back and look at it.
if, you know, nobody's home and it's not bothering anybody and the neighbors don't care,
I don't know.
then it would be a non-issue.
I've been there.
Now, I'm not saying I condone people doing 50 million trips. I'm just saying that I think the trip thing has to be there in order to give them some leverage.
Yeah, some ammo for code
Sometimes
enforcement to be
yeah.
able to actually
Right.
do an enforcement action.
I have a question that I don't wanna ask. I really don't, but we have this nice little section says permitted uses and conditional uses. Is there any reason that we can't have a section called non-permitted uses? And simply say that in R1, these things, you know, nuclear power plants, these things are not happening?
Sober homes,
That's what permitted
residential
uses
treatment
does.
facilities.
Yeah, that's what the omitted uses thing does, it says if it's not specifically allowed, then it's
No, but that,
prohibited.
Yeah, that's,
But-
But that's,
Because otherwise you have the same problem that we had about, what kind of a list are we going to have? It's gonna be 37 pages long, listing all the things you cannot do.
But this one.
but with the changes in technology and everything nowadays, you might be not having them on that list. And,
Well, no,
If
that's
you
the
do
thing,
that,
if it's
it
not
would
on the
be
list,
that
it's.
Clever guys like Young's here is gonna look at that and say, okay, I'm not on this list, but I'm not on this one either, so where do I fall in?
In the
well, you
omitted
get them a nice
uses.
piece of property in a neighboring town.
Or else you go to the business district, which is where we want you to be.
Exactly.
And these are, a home occupation is either a hobby or it's intended to be an incubator space. We're moving on, as your business grows, you move into a business district. What's happened is that when we get into trouble with home occupations is when we don't notice that somebody's gone way beyond, they've succeeded, terrific. But now they're bursting out of the house, and they don't wanna go, they've already made, as we talked before, investments into their facility, and they don't wanna lose that investment, so they're gonna keep going until somebody says something, and then you got enforcement.
So they gotta come back to you because they need to renew the conditional use permit, and they gotta demonstrate that you're still within the parameters
Right.
of what, and if they're not,
And then we have an
No permit.
enforcement issue we have to.
Right.
And I think that should be a footnote, what Tad just said. It should, for people to understand that, you know, success sometimes will often create growth,
I think
and
that's
that
something we're gonna.
growth doesn't necessarily get grandfathered, and that it's going to be reevaluated if you grow beyond
No,
your
That's
borders.
like what Tom was saying.
periods and things.
You have a conditional use, you come back before the planning board every 3 years to get it renewed. And if it looks as if you're going to exceed it, you get told,
Yeah,
Well,
you gotta,
maybe
you
such
gotta,
a one.
you gotta change.
Probably would get told, we'll give you this one, but
And then
you
that-
need to, you got
it's
3
the
years
last
to
one.
start
You
looking.
got-
Yeah, but
you
a
got
lot of
3 years.
people ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and then they come in and they complain that, oh my God, I've spent all this money and I've invested in my business and everybody knows where I
And
am,
if, and
and
if we
they
remind
wanna
them
come,
every time,
and,
if you're told every time you come in for your renewal, that if you exceed the uses of your permit, you're going to have to move to another location.
I think
How
we should
about
say
putting
that
that language
someplace.
on the permit?
That's what
Oh, yeah, we do.
that's what I'm saying,
Well, I think that would be the planning board at the point that they're getting the conditional use.
but I think it helps to say it.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah. Have it
I
in
think
writing.
also making them go every 3 years to renew that conditional use permit also keeps it a little in check.
Are they
Versus,
renewing though, or are they just falling by the wayside, they getting a permit and then they forget to renew?
Well,
and
they-
people
yeah.
do
I think we're pretty good about getting
get renewals?
renewals, yeah.
If they forget to come and renew, then guess what? You don't have a permit. What are you doing?
then you get a visit from somebody you don't
You
want to
can
visit.
probably audit your permit roster
Yep.
periodically.
Yep, that's what we do.
Okay.
Should the need to renew every 3 years be in,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it
Yes.
should be, it should.
It should.
all right,
And you know, there's one other little tidbit that's not in our ordinance that's a reality, that sometimes actually is an impediment, or at least it's a speed bump. And that is life safety code 101. You know, when you put a business in your home, you are required by the state, under the state of Maine law, to meet life safety 101, and you have to have separations. If you have a home and then you're doing, let's say, sculpting, you're doing, you have settling and you're doing metal sculpture, you have to have some very significant safety features installed and some fire separations put in, that's gotta be approved by the fire chief.
Well, then we
And
should
code
say that
enforcement.
too.
Absolutely.
It
And that would
should-
apply to
These
these.
should all be
Right.
explicitly on the permit, so people can't say, well, nobody ever told me that, and I never saw it written anywhere. Well, the answer is, it's there.
That'll be,
Susan, they don't
that'll
get the
be there.
permit until they meet that
That's
criteria.
right.
That's
They don't
correct.
even get it. They
Well,
come in
then
and
we
apply
should-
for it
then we
and say,
need
you
to
gotta
have
do
it
this
in a
stuff.
place where
It
people
is, it's
That's-
on
understand.
that.
Because we do the conditional use, when you come in, one of the conditional uses needs to be, you will get signed off by the fire chief for life safety 101. And if you can't do that, then you can't get a permit.
And you know what, that also,
But that's a
frankly speaking,
conditional use.
applies to type ones either, as well.
Oh, sure.
You have a type one operation that has something that requires a separation by the use code, by the architectural use code. Even if you're a type one, you're obligated, you're required to meet that one life safety 101. My only problem in having them exempt is how do we tell them that? You know, I think we still have to have a registration process of something for type ones, so they don't get into trouble at some future date.
Well, I know I got a call from another town just the other day asking different questions about whether we had things in Arundel as far as, you know, they were looking at revenue generating things, but we don't have a business registration. We have a little form that we have them fill out and then it goes to you and to Jim to verify whether they need a permit or a conditional use or anything. But, you know, I think maybe the board should look into maybe an ordinance or something that the board of selectmen, as far as a business registration ordinance that would say that, you know, they, even if it's like a $25 initial business registration, that's good for, you know, not necessarily annual, cause that's then that becomes a drudgery and stuff, but I think an initial registration, then you know there's businesses in town that, you know, if they're, you know, granted if it, you know, if they're not, I mean, I'm sure you'll have some people that, you know, like a clothing place or whatever that might not, you know, be considered a business, cause maybe they just do it as a hobby.
Yeah, it's an avocation, you sell a game,
Right.
it's a quote every once in a while.
Right, but if you're doing it, you know, as a business, we do have a lot of people that come in and they file a form and then, I don't know what happens later on with it and stuff, but I think it would be kinda nice to have that initial business registration form. And then you've got a list of businesses that are, you know, are actually trying to get out there as a business,
Right.
even
I
if
don't,
it's type
I
one.
don't see charging them as something that
Well,
will
that's,
pass or happen.
we don't have control of that, that's all up to the selectmen.
Yeah,
It'd be $10, it's a business
Yeah,
registration.
you know,
Wouldn't that have to go into some kind of, wouldn't that have to be something that had to be voted on? You can't
yes,
just-
yes, it would have to be,
That's right.
it would
And
have
that's
to be
what
an
I'm saying
ordinance.
is,
But
I
it's,
don't,
it's not anything that we have the control over, that's, that fee comes from the
Well,
selectmen.
unless you would put it in your ordinance and then the board would select it, you would set the fee, cause
It
you
should
set
be
the
from the
fee.
selectmen.
It's
a
a
license.
That's not a land.
It's a
Yeah,
license.
that's not a land
license.
use, right.
So it'd be an, or business registration.
Yeah.
yeah,
ordinance
for
or
some of
something.
these, I mean, I really, you know, if they have to deal with fire code, like almost any of us that have anything in our house have to make sure that things are safe. I don't know that I wanna go after the level one people for
Well,
any
I-
fees
Well,
or
you know, the
any
$10 is more
registrations or.
bookkeeping as far as just kinda keeping the files, that, you know, and stuff.
No, and it's just another $10
Yeah,
bucks.
and
It's-
type one, they're invisible things, you know. Whatever you're doing in your own home for your own amusement and going to a craft fair with.
But we're gonna, if there's somebody that's doing it, as a business, the only way we're gonna know is if they come forward.
Yeah,
So it could
there's
be
no-
out there and you say, come,
Yeah.
you know, if you've got a business doing this, come
You know,
register your business.
If we had something like an arrow that went out to all the residents in town
What a great idea, we need a newsletter.
and actually informed people of things that were necessary or required or of interest, I think that would be a great idea. Maybe put one out about 4 times a year.
Additional
We have
arrow,
a
good
website.
idea.
We don't, you don't use paper anymore, do you?
No,
What about all
Nobody
the,
does.
what about all the
I
people
don't
who
even get
never
mail
go to the
anymore.
website or don't have a computer in
Well, we
this
do when
town?
we send out 3
Yeah.
pages about the new town hall.
Just a
Okay, so
thought.
we're moving right along, so we're all agreed, we'll have type 2 in the R1, we'll have,
The
there'll be
restrictions.
Type 2 will have
somebody else.
the restrictions that we've covered. It will require conditional use permit either from the site plan review committee or from the planning board.
I think you gotta make a decision one way or another, otherwise then you got 3 different types of businesses now. What's gonna be the distinction between staff and
Right.
planning board?
I think they should come before the planning
I
board.
think so too, just with one place.
And just
I
eliminate the
think, I
site
think
review.
it's, yeah. You know,
What-
if
what
they're in site plan review or staff review committee
I
can
mean,
deal
if
with
it-
it in other districts.
And it would fall under a conditional use
Yeah.
permit?
It's
Conditional
Yes.
use permit, yeah.
Right, so I mean,
That's where
that
all
has
my
to come to
conditions
the
would go.
planning board, it doesn't go to site plan or staff review.
Could staff
Well, we
review
did-
handle renewals?
No, I think it should come back before the planning
Okay.
board. We gave them the original.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah, I thought that was a good idea.
I thought so too. It's like, not like we don't have enough on our
Your
plate.
plate, yeah, I was gonna say, you're already busy enough.
We're busy?
Well, but I agree, I mean, I
Yeah.
think it could be, ultimately, I'm confident, whether it's Tad or hopefully, whomever we may have as planner, you know, if Tad ever retires, then
You will.
we, they've got to have some, you know, we're gonna be hiring somebody with a level of responsibility that I think if, you know, Joe, home occupation guy comes in and says, hey, it's me, and I get a guy that comes in and then we leave every day, and we've been doing that for 10 years, why does that have to come before the planning board?
That's a valid point, because we can rely on whoever the site plan
Right.
review committee is to say, no, you gotta go back to the planning board on this one.
Yeah, I mean, if we have a problem with something,
Right.
or more importantly, we have a draw or a denial, we can go there, or we
Yeah.
can just refer it. We say,
Have
we
the
don't
option
feel
to go-
comfortable with the level of what's happening here, you need to
Yeah.
go to the.
Right. Yeah, the planner would always have the option to defer it to the
But we
planning
can-
board.
We can list that out in the conditional uses when they come the first time to get the permit, and we can explain to them what's going on, and the site plan committee will review you in 3 years, and if they think you need to come before us, you'll be back. Okay,
Well, you're gonna have to amend the ordinance to provide for that, because you don't have the authority to issue a conditional use permit, even a renewal.
Who does?
The staff,
staff committee.
that's planning board jurisdiction,
No, we do have this way.
not in land use circumstances, in road circumstances.
No, land use too.
Where?
It's in conditional use, if you look at section,
Created the site plan, the staff review committee for that, to take some of the load off.
take the load off the
The
planning
planning
board.
board.
For site review, not conditional use.
Yeah, conditional use. If you look at 9232,
Uh,
approval by the staff review committee, and if the change of use will result in intensification of use. It says existing conditional use or structure, conditional use which has largely existed, okay, let's keep going.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, perhaps we do.
Yeah.
But it may
Well,
be
you're
something.
just saying
that-
if you
No,
wanna
you're right,
do
it is
that.
in staff review, but remember, the staff review process is the process for both. We made it so there's one process, because there used to be two different processes with different times,
Right.
different criteria. We said, this is stupid. It's all gonna be the staff, instead of rewriting everything, we'll just make it staff review. So the staff review criteria exists also. So if you go over any of those staff review, any of those criteria, which staff review is allowed to do, then you have to go to the planning board. And that includes conditional uses. Because the conditional uses, as you know, are permitted use of
Right, but
conditions.
they
Right.
talk about
If I
renewals,
understand you
they talk about
correctly,
renewals though.
you want-
No,
What
yeah,
happens in
no,
the
sounds right,
ordinance?
we would have to write that in the ordinance
Right.
about.
Yeah,
that's all I'm saying, you gotta amend the
Right.
ordinance.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, I'm sorry, I didn't.
That's
Yeah,
not,
that's what
it's
I'm
not there
talking
now,
about.
that's all I'm
No,
saying.
no, it
Yeah, when
doesn't
we do
exist.
the,
We
when
don't
we
have
do
it.
the home occupation section, we could just.
Right.
And the only renewals that the planning board does is basically solid waste facilities
Gravel pits.
and gravel pits. Those are the only renewals they do right now.
Mhm.
And no, we do
Not
the
auto salvage.
Oh,
auto
auto
salvage as well.
Auto salvage, right. So, those are the three.
But yeah, we could put that in there without much of a problem.
And compost facility.
Solid waste facility.
Okay,
How many trips did we decide upon?
did we decide?
30.
I was all
26
right
was
with 30.
one of the
I don't
numbers,
ask that question.
30 is another, so.
It just has to be an even,
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
otherwise somebody
31 and a
can't go
half.
home with
It's like
it.
25.
Right.
25
So
doesn't
30
work.
trips is actually 15 round trips, it's not,
But that's a client or a customer every half hour on an 8-hour day.
What's the
Maximum.
objection to just defining the two, trips generated by the occupation, and just not even worry about your family?
Right. Yeah, oh, yeah,
Yes.
and I
How do you
threw the 10 out
segregate
just
that?
as a
Never
rough
gonna
one.
get
That's what I thought you were saying.
Yeah.
I would love to do that, but let's say we're in enforcement action, and we decide we're gonna.
Enforcement of that is gonna be a problem regardless.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Actually, the
That's why I
language,
don't like it that
Yeah.
much, to be honest with you.
yeah.
the language in the original ordinance is, the home occupation shall not create greater traffic than normal for the area in which it is located or generate more than X vehicle trips per day, which means that the home occupation shall not generate more than X vehicle trips. It says nothing about the occupants of the home.
Okay, so we could,
It's sort of already there, just like that.
I don't, let's make that a little clearer in language, but I mean,
And that would be 20 trips, if it's no more than what's normal, and the normal being a 10 trips for a single-family home, 10 average trips for a single-family home, then we're talking 20.
So my only problem with that is separating it, I know it's kind of bogus, I really don't think it works anyways, but if you had a pissed off neighbor that did not like the home occupation, and they set out a trail camera to take pictures, to document.
Yep.
You can't differentiate home, you can't argue, that was my home, that was me, that was my daughter.
That's my friend.
It is literally going to take pictures and be able to document trips. So if you were policing, that would be the only way, you can't differentiate, you need to just say period, home, and
but somebody was gonna complain that, he comes to the code enforcement officer, says, this is generating more trips for the business.
right?
Here's my evidence of that, well, you as the home
Right.
occupation person, can explain it to the code enforcement officer, that's my son's friend.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand,
So-
that's why I'm
so
saying
there
that
isn't.
it needs to be it doesn't, You're saying trips, right?
And ultimately, I would like to, I think we should throw it out there, trips, make it clear, X number, however many, what we decide on, trips associated with the business. I mean, and I know it may be
I
tough to
think that's where it
enforce.
gets, I think that's where it's hard for any code enforcement officer
So
to
enforcement.
say which one's a business versus which one's a home.
It's gonna be hard.
Right,
Anyway.
Just
No matter what.
generating
Yeah.
the trips, counting the trips,
Right.
period.
And you
That's the
should
problem, we're
define
having
one
that,
of
we're on Riverwind right now, that's exactly the problem, what's
But if you
personal,
had to
what's
count
not.
trips, and it was just trips, even as an attorney, you'd have to agree that if it says trips, no matter who it is, versus home versus business, it's still a little bit easier to see how many cars are
It may
going in
be,
and
but
out.
is that fair to the home occupation? Because what if I've got
What happens if
somebody,
you have a
somebody moves
driveway
home from
like
college,
mine where everybody
that had been
turns
living
in?
there for several years, and now the trips that I
Right.
said I had, I've got more now, and I'm over the limit,
Right.
my business gotta shut down,
You know, there's a way to do this with algebra, seriously.
algebra.
Math is
Well,
not-
if you factor in the number of
Put algebra
resident
in front of
occupants of the home,
Yeah,
then that addresses your issue.
yeah,
So I think, I mean, you can figure out the algebraic equation, it's not a complicated one, where the number of occupants of the home is a variable that is known,
Yeah.
will become known. And then you plug in whatever the desired number for the business trips is.
How do you distinguish between the fact that I got in my car and I went food shopping and came back, from I got in my car and I went to pick up supplies for my business and came back? It's still
Why does that
being-
matter?
Well, because one is a business associated trip, which I wouldn't make if I didn't have a business, and the other is I just live there and I need to eat trip.
That's gonna be an
But-
inherent problem.
yeah.
all the
And
time.
ultimately, I think the regulation is on additional trips coming in from outside parties, not necessarily the trips generated that are quasi-normal by the household.
And right
You
now
know,
you're talking,
customers coming or
Yeah.
patrons of the business coming.
right now you're talking about enforcement.
Right.
Okay?
Oh, we
What-
know that's impossible anyway.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is in order to get a permit, you've gotta come forward before the planning board and demonstrate on some basis, this is how many trips this business will generate.
Yep.
Okay? And if it's under the limit, then you're entitled to your permit. If you can demonstrate that to the planning board. I'm sure there's some ways to do that.
Do we define trips someplace? If we
Yeah.
don't, we should.
No, it's the,
If we don't, it's defined by the DOT.
yeah, that's
Okay.
the trip
But we've
generation.
already asked the question, is it a
I
round
think
trip
it's
or a
actually,
single
you
trip?
identify it as
So-
ITE.
Yeah, do we reference something?
I think we reference ITE.
So, let's
So if we,
reference
if
something.
we assume two employees is actually going to be,
4 trips for
it's not gonna be 4,
There's lunch.
Could be eight.
you've got lunch.
Who knows? I mean, you never know what
So
people are doing.
you've got another 4 trips, you're looking at 8, figure 8 trips if they go out for lunch.
Yep.
So I think if we said, 18 trips for the business, and not, you know, I'm not interested in how many
Yeah.
Marty's favorite Harvey homeowner drives in and out of, I don't care if they drive in and out of their driveway, back up and drive back up the driveway. It's not a business trip,
They
it's a
start
stupid use of a
picking people
vehicle.
up at the bottom of their driveway and driving them up
But,
and dropping.
You know, I think if we said 18 or round it to 20, I'd say you're allowed 20 business trips a day. If it's difficult to enforce, that's not difficult, let's be honest, it's almost impossible to enforce. But it's a standard that, we can say, this is the standard that you have to meet, and if you exceed this standard, your permit's at risk. And if your neighbor complains about it, your neighbor better show up and be able to prove that you violated 20 trips. Because I'm not gonna ask the homeowner to justify every trip in and out by them and their 5 kids, it's,
Yes, cause somebody
You know,
with a
you
teenager
prove
can
that
have
they-
to go in and out 30 times in a day.
Yeah.
I'm
But
in and
it's
out
a
of my house
no-no when
4 or
they
5
get the
times.
permit.
There's no way
And
to
I
do
think
this now.
when they get their permit, and they know at the point that they get their permit, that this is a limitation.
Right.
I think that then they can't, well, I didn't know, and, you know,
Well, and the known limitation will, for 90% of the people, will act as a deterrent.
That's correct.
So what's the number?
I'm thinking.
Well, I think it's kind of following with, Ann's ideas, using math, you just say 6N, N being the number of occupants with driver's licenses.
I thought we were just talking business trips.
Why don't you leave it
Hold
to
that
the
thought
planning
while I
board?
finish mine, thank you.
Why not leave it to the planning board?
6,
Why don't you make it a condition of the permit? Because, I mean, you know, if you got 3 daughters in a household, you're cooked. You know, you'll get 40 trips just, and that's boyfriends and.
I'm gonna say, it's not just daughters.
True, well, it's just my experience, let's put it
Just
that way.
saying.
But
Putting that out
the
there.
simple fact is, you know, it's gonna be impossible, I mean, the first part of this is appropriate, you know, we should not exceed the amount of traffic. That's for
Right.
for the general area.
Right.
And the planning board can, and you can say, or exceed the number of trips as specified by the planning board.
On what basis does the planning board
Yeah,
know the number?
Right.
Well, what they'll do is, I mean, that would be one of the things, well, you gotta make it flexible in some sense, because as Dot says, if you have a house full of kids, or Jamie's saying you got,
I'm with
Somebody
Sean,
there,
and
and
I'm
you've
with
got an
you,
activity,
we need a mathematical equation.
you should be able to say,
Pupils in the house.
you should be able to tell you
multiply
basically
that,
how
and then
much
over and above.
but
It's the
trips
only
you're
way
gonna
that
have,
you-
because otherwise, we're gonna put a limit on somebody for something.
Hey, Don,
If
the
we're gonna
problem
get
with
the whole
having
house.
a mathematical equation that says you've got X number of people in the house, assumes that they're only going out and back once a day.
Right.
What do you do? with the
No.
kid
No,
who
no, no,
goes-
no, no,
What do
no,
you do
that's
with
not
a
a-
retired
that's
couple?
not a
who
thing.
goes
If,
out?
if I could actually finish my thought 5 minutes ago,
Yeah.
but I
No,
started,
why would we allow that to happen?
I know, I feel like I'm back at home. Okay,
So don't drive back and forth.
For- the rough formula I'm just thinking about, 6N, N being the number of occupants of the house that have driver's licenses, 6 being the number of trips a day, once, twice, and then 3, and then 4 and 5. Each occupant figuring they can go in and out 3 times.
Okay.
Alright, so that's 6. So you got 6N plus 26 equals whatever. And then that
Over and
being
above.
being the maximum number.
You see, cause I'm
of
just looking at it, instead of
trips.
the 6N plus the business trips, why not just say, these are the business trips?
Right,
Yeah.
which is,
Right, so, because if you got the nosy neighbor that likes to get their nose into your business and go, well, there was vehicles going in and out 40 times. Well, let's see,
Prove
they
that-
got
prove the businesses.
3 occupants of the house that have driver's licenses, roughly figuring they're going in and out 3 times, so that's 6 per person, 6 times 3, that's 18, they're allowed 25 or 26, you know, that's 41, or not, that's 42, something like that. But, I mean,
But the issue becomes what happens, and I understand what you're saying, yeah, you could have a formula to do it, I think it's easier to just say, here's the number of business trips that you're allowed, because if I wanna have a party at my house, those people are
Right.
not business people, and there's gonna be more than 20 of them.
It could be.
So
And-
how
and
many
you're-
business trips?
I'm thinking 20 business trips,
Cause
And that's a lot of
10.
business.
that's a lot of
I
business
think,
trips.
yeah, I think ultimately most home occupations wouldn't get close to that.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
But it would
10
provide
round
some
trips.
flexibility. Now, at 20, you know, if you were a single practitioner psychiatrist that got a car in an hour over an 8-hour day, that's less than 20 trips.
That's right.
And so what's wrong? Wouldn't that
I'm not
be-
saying anything, I'm just throwing that out there,
And if you
that,
had a receptionist slash secretary in there, that person's gonna generate another
Yeah.
4 trips.
4 to 6 trips or something.
Yeah,
Yep.
so I think that would work out well, but that's just my opinion.
if the language says, the home occupation shall not create greater traffic than normal for the area in which it is located or generate more than, I'm going with this number now, 20 vehicle trips per day associated with the business.
Yes.
That's what I'm thinking,
That,
because if you've got, it says not greater than the neighborhood, but if you've got a business, it's gonna be greater than what you're normally gonna have associated with the neighborhood. Cause everybody else is leaving, coming back at the end of the day, and you're gonna have people in and out during the day.
As part of.
And we could
well,
restrict the hours of operation.
But
I was just gonna
ultimately,
say
in a
that.
neighborhood setting, you know, most people are gone in the day, an
Yep.
occasional trip in and out is not really
Not even gonna be
noticeable.
seen.
No.
Yeah.
But that's why you would restrict hours of operation and say you can't do it after
Right.
6 PM or 7 PM, because you don't want people.
Right, and I
Coming
think
down
that
the
is something, since it is in a residential area, that,
Mhm.
But again, that's something that the planning board can set for terms and times, and say, this is what we're gonna have. But how do you feel about, how does everybody feel about 20 business trips?
Okay with it? Just
I'm
not
fine
saying
with
we have
it.
to enforce it.
I'm fine with
Yeah,
You know,
they're okay.
Straw poll.
No matter
Yeah.
what number.
Yeah,
I'm
So,
okay.
looks like it's warm to that number. Take a vote?
take a
Yes.
look.
20?
20 people. Okay,
Okay.
looks like it's 20 people. Or
20
20
trips.
trips.
20
Sorry,
trips.
20
Don't
trips.
confuse us.
20 trips.
Was that unanimous? Looks like it was.
It looked like it.
But that'll stay trips, that won't be ADT, so that will not be average daily trips, that'll be trips.
No,
period.
Trips.
Yeah.
Okay. How about retail?
No,
Retail's a lot.
well, the problem is, even the retail's gonna be limited by the trips.
that's right. It's a home occupation, will be limited by the trips, and that's what we're looking at.
But we also have language that sort of addresses that. Sale of products should be limited to those which are grown, raised, crafted, assembled, prepared, and substantially altered on the premises. Incidental sales of items which are accessory and incidental to a service provided on the premises may be permitted, such as hair products from beauty salon. That was from the original ordinance.
Oh, I know.
Now, just out of curiosity, how is this gonna affect like the blueberry place?
It shouldn't, it's agricultural.
Okay,
Yeah, because a lot of these
Farm
things,
stand status.
you know, are not, commercial equestrian is not.
They're not
a
home occupations.
It's
Okay.
Contract yard is
Okay.
not a home occupation.
okay.
I think the only one that fits in there is probably the daycare,
Yeah.
Daigle daycare on Limerick Road.
Does,
The rest of these are not.
But is daycare not in?
Daycare's a separate facility.
Right.
Right, but
Is
she
it a
can't have
permitted
very
or-
many kids
Is it a
with 1
permitted
acre.
or conditional use in the
But
R
she
one?
doesn't, yeah, she doesn't have the size necessary for a group daycare home.
Right,
I mean,
date,
it's a state license for a daycare home, and it's, comma, home, is 6 kids.
When we look at our R one ordinance
Yeah.
as crafted today,
Yeah.
is daycare listed as a permitted or conditional use?
It was I think we had it in type 1.
No,
Because
no,
it-
forget home occupation.
Daycare home.
It's a
So-
conditional use.
It doesn't fall into the home
No, it
occupation
doesn't, it's a
category.
conditional use.
Okay.
Right,
yeah. And it, not only is it restricted by the number of kids, but I believe this state statute in regards to daycares also says you have to have so much indoor space per kid
Yeah.
and so much outdoor space per kid.
but because it's listed separate, it's
It's
a
not-
whole
it's not-
category
By itself.
beyond home occupation.
Right.
I have one other question, simply because I did this when I lived elsewhere, and I had UPS come in the morning. Sometimes he'd check back in the middle of the day, and he'd come to pick up in the afternoon, so you could have
You've
FedEx.
got 6 trips if the guy does
That's
that.
what I'm saying, you could have UPS, so maybe there should be some language about deliveries by common carriers.
Ultimately, I think that's part of your business model.
Okay, so then that just
Yeah.
comes
And
into
if you're doing
the
that
trip.
many trips,
Right.
maybe you should think about going to a business.
I totally agree, I just,
If you've got nobody else coming in and out, have at it.
Problem.
Yeah.
Have the
No,
guy show up
I
every
hate
2
to say
hours.
it, but the neighbor that used to be next to me, they had UPS,
FedEx.
FedEx,
Yeah.
and there's another one, there's the third one. And it was like, they were like clockwork. And there was no business, there was absolutely no business, they just buy a lot of stuff online.
Well, now with Amazon, everybody's.
Amazon,
Christmas,
Whole
I
Foods
know.
will start delivering to you soon.
Don't get bad
Starbucks
ideas,
will
they'll start
deliver to you.
regulating that.
What was that?
I don't wanna regulate that.
No,
Okay.
I'm just saying that that's a hard thing to regulate,
Okay.
like mail delivery and stuff like that, that's a really hard thing to regulate.
Nor
So-
should we
so
be
let's-
regulating.
No, you don't wanna regulate,
No.
what you wanna
Right,
do is
yeah.
not create
Really.
something
Yep.
that
Right.
causes more than normal
Right.
activity in a neighborhood that affects the quality of life of the residential neighborhood, that's the only thing.
So let's-
To make it innocuous.
Let's
Right.
bring it back
Discreet,
around
as we call
and
it.
clarify, we're talking type 2, 20 business trips, no more than 2 employees, you're restricted in terms of the square footage of your house, will restrict the hours And this is stuff that the planning board can work up, and the hours, and there'll be conditional use permits that are renewable. And the planning board will work up all of the details related to the kinds of businesses and what the conditional uses are for those permits.
And one non-illuminated sign no larger than 8 square feet. That was also in the original
Yep.
ordinance.
So if you're a type 2, you get
We
one sign.
doubled it, it used to be 4 square
It was
feet.
very generous.
We doubled it a couple of years back. You get eight
4
square foot sign
4 square feet.
if you are a type 2 home occupation.
It's not very big, so
Oh,
that's, should
okay.
be.
I think it's big.
That's.
It is
yeah.
big, actually, it's
Big.
2 by
2 by
4,
4 is a good size.
2 feet by 4 feet, it's not a small
Half a
size.
sheet of plywood.
Yeah.
Like the those two windows up there.
Yeah, it's those 2 windows,
That's a little
actually, it's
bigger.
more than those 2 windows.
It's probably
Yeah, it's pretty close to the size of the state.
half the size.
So, yeah, I think that'll work for everybody. Good. We can put that to bed and give the planning board some stuff to do. The next item,
There's more?
well, that covers because that's home occupation categories, conditional use categories, that go to the planning board. The next one is the farm overlay district. We met it, last week. And the thought came up that if we do, instead of doing the animal husbandry and the agriculture and going through that entire process, I believe it was Luke that had suggested 2 weeks ago, that we might be able to work something out with Maine Department of Agriculture where we work in the best practices of them into the ordinance. So I had suggested to the planning board, maybe we could do a farm overlay district, townwide. Create different standards for what it's gonna look like, but for the most part, instead of going through and coming up with all of the different kinds of regulations, if we use best practices as defined by Maine Department of Agriculture, we don't have to rewrite that whole ordinance. And the last time, I don't know how much time we spent on it the last time, only to have it shot down. Well, it didn't get shot down, it got pulled because if it had gone through, it would have been shot down. So we spent 6 months or more working on that. So I think to avoid that, I think if we can work up a farm overlay district that says in these different areas, and basically it's gonna be, you're gonna have to have a minimum amount of acreage, you're gonna have to have setbacks and other standards, but you then have to follow what the Department of Agriculture says are the best practices. We're just looking at giving it a shell and letting the Department of Agriculture say, okay, this is the inside criteria that you have to meet.
And ultimately, that's what we were looking to do, was to regulate specific types of, farming that we didn't feel would be appropriate in town. And then also to, limit certain spots, or, certain quantities in certain areas, and encourage the best practices. So, I wouldn't have any issue with that.
To me, that resolves the whole issue of, how we're gonna handle this, animal husbandry.
Now, the one caveat in that, would it be for everyone, for any amount of non-domesticated animal that they chose to have on their property?
Well, no.
Like say if I decide I wanna have 3 rabbits, where does it delineate? Where, do we
Well,
go
We were
from,
talking about rabbits, so tomorrow you'll have 6, and the day after you'll have a dozen.
well,
No,
and
you
then,
won't. It's
then
not that easy.
coyotes will cut it back down to 2.
That's right. No, I
I don't know that we
think,
need
that's a valid point. At what point do we say,
Right.
okay, it's moved out from that range?
Cause
We were-
one of my, I remember one of the things that I wanted to make clear, and probably, obviously we didn't do that great of a job of it, was that most of the really small hobby scale farms wouldn't have fallen into the regulation that was proposed.
That was the big issue, because we couldn't get people to understand this is
Right.
just commercial.
Right.
We're not talking about you're having a horse in the backyard, or you're having a cow or a pig.
So we don't wanna make the same mistake.
No,
In that anybody that has 3 chickens or 2 rabbits or a goat thinks that they've gotta go out and do a whole lot of BMPs of some sort.
Following the same pattern as we just did with home occupation, and I brought this up at the last meeting. Thought about it since, emailed a copy to
Right, yep.
you and to Tad. Sorry, folks.
Oh, I printed them off, I thought I was about to.
Oh, well, we have lots of copies of this. Email me and let me know, but that's
It was the
okay.
last minute thing I was doing, so
Right.
nobody would bring it, 'cause I thought, I didn't know, so I just wanted to.
Well, no, I didn't want to do that, but I thought that was inappropriate, since we had it. That's all right.
You got, just need one?
Chip needs one too, right? Chip, do you have one?
I got one,
Okay,
thank you.
great.
Everybody have one? 'Cause I have an extra one. All set?
I have plenty.
And Tad has 65.
15 more.
Basically, what's on the first page is sort of the same thing as typos for home occupation. I did a little playing in the dictionary, because I didn't see the sense for the small backyard, whatever you're doing, splitting that into agriculture and animal husbandry. Because chances are you're gonna do a little bit of other thing. So you might have a cow and 2 pigs and 4 ducks and 1 rabbit. So I define farm, for the purposes of this discussion, tract of land devoted to agriculture, animal husbandry, or a combination thereof. Agriculture being the cultivation of soil, producing and raising crops, including gardens, greenhouses, nurseries, and versions thereof, and that came from our current ordinance, but not forestry management, timber harvesting activities, and cultivation of marijuana. Animal husbandry, raising and/or breeding of domesticated animals not traditionally recognized as pets, which would eliminate kennels, and which are housed or kept in a building or enclosure other than a residential building. And then as a permitted use, again, no contact with the town, family, and the suggestion was made a while ago, hobby farm, but family farm seemed to me to be a better description. Farm including agriculture and/or animal husbandry for non-commercial purposes, for which may provide supplemental household income. No registration or permitting is required by the town. Carried on only by residents of the associated dwelling unit, may not adversely alter the residential character of the neighborhood. Animals shall be contained in a building, coop, cage, pen, fencing, or other enclosure with a setback of an appropriate number of feet from abutting properties or roads. Animal waste, and this was brought up at the last meeting, animal waste, compost, or fertilizer shall not be deposited or stockpiled within a setback of an appropriate number of feet from abutting properties or roads, or within whatever feet of a well. Farming activities shall not create greater traffic than is customary for the area in which it's located. And then that would cover Dewston's operation with maple syrup and honey. It would, that's why I put enclosure, because that would include beehives. It would, I think, cover anything that anyone wanted to do on a small scale on their property, primarily for their own use, but possibly for sharing.
Mr. Chairman? One comment?
Yep.
Just as the home occupation allows 2 employees, I would respectfully suggest that allowing 1 employee for the family farm. Because a lot of us are gonna have somebody either part-time or full-time who's, comes in and maybe helps move animals a few times a week or whatever, or just clean stalls. I would respectfully suggest that 1 employee would be.
Did you all hear that? Because he's making the recommendation that you be allowed 1 employee on family farm, because you're going to have other people that are going to come in. You may, the people that live in the house may both have jobs someplace else.
Or they may be elderly
Or they
and
may be
wanna
elderly.
maintain, right, and they
Yeah.
wanna maintain their farm, but they need help. I think that,
The thing I like about this definition, it's for non-commercial purposes. So we could look at it and say from I still think there needs to be, a minimum acreage amount because of the animal waste, and the setbacks that are going to be required. I think it's gonna force you to have a minimum number of acres, because you can't do it on a 1 acre lot.
Well, I don't know about that necessarily.
I agree.
Well, I think, yes, yeah, well, it depends upon what you're doing.
Exactly.
You can have a beehive on a 1 acre lot with no problem at all,
But you can't have 5 cows.
but you can't have 5 cows or
You'd be hard
50,000
pressed to have
chickens.
2 cows
Right.
on a 1 acre.
So I think I'm not necessarily in objections to that, because maybe as an overall statement, we can have a minimum number of acreage for R1, R2,
Yes. And
for something like this.
And that's what I was thinking of with the farm overlay, because
But-
there'd be minimum.
But the problem's going to be, if you say that in R1, for people who have 1 acre, you have to have 2 acres to do any of this, you're not gonna pass that either.
Right, cause I
So-
know like in Biddeford, I had a friend that lives, I mean, they're very, very close, in like 50 by 100 lots at the most and stuff, and the neighbor had a chicken coop in their backyard, and as long as you don't have a rooster, you're allowed to keep chickens in these very small, downtown lots even, as long as you don't have a rooster. And
But the advantage to having chickens in Biddeford is that Biddeford has public water. It's lousy
Right.
water and it's highly chlorinated, but they have
right,
public water. We don't have public water here. Do you really wanna
Well,
risk?
You've got a limitation of, within so many feet of a well.
Right.
So-
And that was part of
that's
the reason
also
that I was saying
self-limiting.
that you needed to have, you may wanna have a larger portion of land because of the restrictions of setbacks for the buildings and setbacks for waste containment and other things from the wells. On a 1 acre lot, if you have a 200-foot setback from a well, good luck,
Well, you can't.
you can't.
So that's self-limiting. So that limits what you can do right there.
Okay.
So because I only have
Yeah.
1 acre, I can't raise elephants, no matter how hard I try, it's not gonna work for me. But I could keep 2 chickens, or I could have a beehive,
Okay.
or I could have a backyard garden, and then sell some of the produce to my neighbors.
You could also carry out the waste, composting it and sell it, and so the waste is really literally hardly ever there.
Right.
We're talking about something like rabbits or something like that.
Oh, there's nothing better than rabbit poop,
I know,
It's also
I
stable.
know that.
Okay.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's not hot, you can use it directly, it won't burn anything, as opposed to chicken. We'll talk later.
Okay. Looking forward to it.
Now, were you gonna do anything with the one
Chief.
person?
Yeah,
Family farm?
That's where we got started. What do you guys
Yeah,
think
it's
about
burnt
the
up all
idea
of a
of
sudden.
allowing the family farm to have 1 employee?
Well, my concern with that, and it may be a seasonal thing, but my concern with that is that you could have a family farm that has quite a bit of acreage that they hay. You're not gonna have somebody there full-time, but if you're a small family, there's no way you can bring all that hay in by yourself. But if you can only hire 1 person, that's gonna make it very difficult to be able to bring it all in.
But if you're
when you
doing
have
that
to.
amount of hay, are you then non-commercial? What are you doing with all that hay?
Well, it says here, but which may provide supplemental household income. I mean, you could have your, you could
That's a matter of
have,
quantity.
right, so you could have your own animals, your own horses, your own beef cattle that you're using the hay for, and then you may sell some of it on the side. I'm just throwing it out there because
What if we allowed for seasonal employees?
That's not even an employee necessarily, that's like.
Just
contract.
like a contract, that's
Yeah,
just somebody
that's
contracted to
yeah,
to do
that's
the hay,
true,
and that's not
Yeah,
an
that's a
employee.
service, that's
Yeah.
a service
Yeah,
provider.
you're just hiring somebody, the same way you'd hire them to come in and clean your house.
Mhm.
Well, I've hired you to come in and clean the land.
Mow the lawn, right.
Did,
Yeah, Jeff?
can I make a practical observation?
No,
In today's world, nobody has their own haying equipment.
yeah,
There-
you
there
end up
just a-
contracting it out.
There are just a few people that do it, and if you have a field that you wanna have hayed, you find one of those 3 people
Mhm.
to come in and do it, and they're not an employee. You certainly wouldn't object to the number being 2 employees, but I'm just saying, it, with a specific example of hay, no farmers, and my grandfather used to do his own hay. We used to do our own long time ago, but nobody does it today, because the equipment's too expensive.
I think if it's gonna be a permitted use, that 1 should be the maximum number of employees. And if you have more than 1, then you have to get, then it's no longer considered to be, non-commercial.
Family farm.
Yeah, it's not a family farm anymore.
Yeah, and I think considering the scale that this was intended to encompass, that's more than sufficient.
How about 1 full-time, 1 part-time?
How about 1?
I'll go with
If
one.
it's a, you know, if it's a family farm, by definition, that implies that the family's working there as well.
That's right.
So you're gonna have at least 2 people working in the field.
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, but if you go on vacation, then you've got one person that has to do it all.
When's the last time you saw a farmer take a vacation?
That's why you,
It's wicked.
Okay,
Anyway,
how do you feel about 1? Is 1 good? Should it be higher?
I don't think it should be higher.
You know, I think 1 is fine.
All those in favor of 1?
Yeah,
Have you-
that makes
Have you
sense.
thought about
I
the
think so, yeah.
species though?
No,
No species change yet.
and there shouldn't be.
you can have almost anything on a family farm, why would you limit it?
Well, you're talking about putting this in the R1 district.
I think one of the species that came up a lot when planning board was discussing it was guinea hens.
Indians,
Hmm.
swine.
Miserable.
And then pigs, I think it would be, might be an issue, we had an issue with pigs a long time ago.
No,
In a small area.
Do not get me started on pigs. It
Please
is
don't
not
get
the
us started
pigs,
on
it's
pigs.
how you raise
Right,
them.
Yes.
but,
And
yeah,
if you're talking.
Like kids.
Yes,
Just like kids.
there you go. For this purpose, if somebody had a pig or 2 pigs and they observed the appropriate setbacks, you're not going to know that they had a pig or 2 pigs. It's when you have 50 pigs and you don't clean up after them properly, or you don't house them properly, then you have issues. So that's page 2.
But I think if you have 50 pigs, quite honestly, you're in commercial.
yes.
Oh, absolutely,
Definitely.
yes.
So we may wanna look at this and say from a family farm, you are restricted to X number of animals. Without saying,
No.
How can you do that?
how can I tell you you can only have 10 cows? Easy, you
Well-
can only have 10 cows.
You can, but I'm questioning the wisdom of trying. For example,
We just went through the whole thing with trip generation. It's not a question of whether, we can say to people, you can only have 10 cows. Until somebody complains about the fact that you've got 12, nobody's ever gonna know about it to start with.
so when you say you can only have, let's say 10 animals, to pick a number,
Okay,
okay? Does that mean I can have 2 ducks, 2 horses, 2 cows, 2 pigs,
yeah,
or 10 bees?
bees, you know, it raises a valid point, and it creates a problem. I don't know how to address that particular issue, because if all you have is 2 bees, you aren't gonna get much honey.
But I
I
think by
think
the
most towns-
definition of a family farm, I don't think that, I think it'd be either hobby farm or family farm. Most people aren't thinking of 10 cows, 10 cows becomes a chore.
Right.
That is a commercial, at that point, you're making you get a lot of,
Investment.
either beef
Well,
or.
The thing is, number 2, the activity may not adversely alter the residential character of the neighborhood.
Smell or noise.
Okay.
Right, and I think when you start getting into the setback from
Yeah.
the abutting properties, which will take care of some of the issues that we heard about the last time, that also limits. So if you have a little tiny lot and you have to set it back,
Mhm.
that's gonna limit what you can have.
Yeah, and you find out the only place you can put the cow is actually in your living room, because of the setbacks
Right.
where your house is.
You
And then,
might wanna
right.
rethink that.
I think
So you
there's a
have
parable
setbacks from
about
the-
that.
of the abutters.
With the camels.
And then you have
Yeah.
that you can't be X from a well, and it doesn't specify your well, it can be
It's
your
from
well,
a
your
well.
neighbor's well,
Yeah.
and I don't know, what's the setback from your septic system to your?
100 feet.
100.
And that's, the problem with that is that's an average, and it's not based on soils or anything. Sometimes 100 feet's not enough, sometimes it's more than enough, and many times the soils, it's not enough.
So what you do is you arrow on the side and you put a little extra in there and you say, you can't have any of this within 150 feet.
And that would knock out a 1 acre. If you, I mean, it sounds to me like this would be something that if you wanted to just have some pigs and some chickens, if you're a 1 acre lot, it's not gonna happen.
It'd be really difficult in most places,
Yeah.
yeah. But you
So
can,
now we're restricting people from having animals in a 1 acre lot.
Well, you could still have some
We're
chickens.
restricting people in the R1 with 1 acre, yes.
Yes,
Yes.
and I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
So what?
because you don't have the room for it.
You don't have the room for it.
So, cause, one thing we're not really thinking about, guys, if you've ever lived next to horses or pigs, it's not, you got the smell, and I don't even think you can have a pig on it, to be honest with you. I don't care what you do with that pig, but the flies, the manure generates flies. And what I've seen and I've witnessed, is it literally takes down the quality of life on your neighbor that's got 1 acre
Yeah.
that cannot have a barbecue anymore. So it's impacting the neighbors, so it's being able to keep that manure on that 1 acre.
It's not just the 1 acre zones, because the guy next to me has 2 pigs. I can smell them 3 or 4 days. When it gets hot
That
in the
wind, when you
summertime,
get that little
I can
breeze.
smell
Absolutely.
his pigs.
can.
I'm not gonna complain about it, I'm not gonna do anything, I don't care, he's got 2 pigs.
You mentioned it a lot, though.
It's a reality.
That's quite
It's a reality, it's there, the
But I
chickens
didn't move
constantly
into
come
a
over.
1 acre.
I think they look great, one of these days I'm gonna put one in a pot and see it.
Expecting to have that.
Hope he
Yeah.
tastes better than he looks.
The guy next door got guinea hens, they all came to my house, I go for it.
Yeah.
I got enough property, I
He
don't
can,
care.
he can come, they can come over and they can eat up all of the grubs that are in my grass, I don't care.
Well, I'll tell
They
you,
eat
I have
It's
got
not
3
only
complaints on guinea hens.
Guinea hens, I guess.
And they were on 2 acre lots, cause they always flew over to his house, you know, but, yeah.
well,
Guinea hens you can't contain, unless you keep them inside, they fly wherever they wanna go.
Well,
That's if they have wings.
Sort of the nature of birds.
Is that a
It's not the
noise
major
thing?
birds that
Isn't that a
scream
noise
like
thing?
that.
It is a noise thing.
Right, but wouldn't
Yeah.
that fall under the category of a noise thing?
Yeah.
If they were,
Guinea hens?
right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that eliminate it?
Well, under what
Never even
noise?
heard mine.
If I have a beagle and it's out there barking all the time and you get enough complaints from your neighbor, so many minutes, isn't there, I mean, again,
We-
it's
animal
enforcing
control,
it.
animal control ordinance takes care of the barking dog issue.
Yeah, but I don't think they have a.
But as
There
far
is
as
no
other-
noise ordinance,
Yeah, but the noise ordinance is for, really for repetitive.
have you ever
Construction.
freaking heard of a guinea hen?
Yes, I have. I do have personal experience with guinea.
I've never heard my guinea
Okay.
hens make any
Regular.
noise.
So,
Yeah, that's right. Continuing.
Yeah, what was that, what were the three terms?
regular, continuous, and frequent.
Frequent. Yeah, those.
Yeah, guinea hens, all 3 of them.
That was
All
in
ones.
the minutes from the 29th of
Yep.
November.
I mean,
What is
very
it?
clear.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, it's obnoxious.
okay, so we look at it and we say from the perspective of the number of animals or the type of animals, that's gonna get resolved just based on the fact that you may not be able to have them in certain areas. And in the R1, you may not be able to have them if all you have is 1 acre.
Right.
Oh, well. You know,
and depending upon the shape of your land,
you may not be
you
able to
may
have
not
them.
be able to have them if you have 2 acres.
Yeah. You could have, a half acre on street frontage that goes back 4 lots, it gives you 2 acres, but you're only 200 feet wide all the way down through.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a problem. Cause you're not, no matter where you set it, you're not gonna get within, the boundaries of your property. Or if you do, you're gonna have to stake that cow down in that one spot, he's not allowed to move. That's probably not gonna work. Well, you know, if we say that it's gotta be 100-foot setback, then you have to stake that cow in the middle of that little trail, and he's not allowed to go anywhere. It would create that kind of an issue,
Yes,
You
it
have
would.
to make a cow run.
as opposed to the
Can't
deer
have
run.
100-foot setback
dog
for a
run.
field.
Yeah, I've seen dogs run a lot, usually after the deer run. Okay,
So,
well,
we're
let's
not gonna
let's
have-
take a look at that. Oh, no, go ahead, you were
No,
gonna
I was
say.
just gonna say, And so we're not looking at any minimum acreage at all in the,
No, I think it'll self-restrict.
I think so too.
Yeah. We're gonna have to try it and find out, if it doesn't,
Yeah,
and
maybe
enough
change.
people complain about it, we'll have an ordinance back in front of the town meeting going, all of these people are saying, you know, it's not big enough, we need something else. But I think to start off, yeah, we can try it this way. So the question becomes, for number 3, animals shall be contained in a building, coop, cage, pen, fencing, or other enclosure with a setback of how many feet from abutting properties or roads?
Well, the R1 side yard setback and rear setback are 25 feet for buildings.
25 feet?
I don't think it's enough, quite honestly. I think if you're talking about having a farm, with a bunch of animals, it needs to be further back than that.
Don't buildings have to be 50 feet off the property line?
Well, this is the
No.
side yards are
Oh,
the
side
side
yard.
Front and front setback.
The problem is that when you have side yards, butting side yards, you have
You have 50 feet.
50 feet doing that, but that's where people live, is in the backyards. The irony is that the front yard setback is to create uniformity, visual uniformity along the street, that's why they stress that, and
I
far
think
enough.
traditionally it is anyway.
Yes, traditionally, we still
More
can
highly
do that.
developed
And, but the irony is that we all live in our backyards, generally in that kind of neighborhood, in a dense neighborhood.
I got a swamp behind my house, I don't stay anywhere else.
Mosquitoes will carry you away.
Oh my God.
I'd like to add the word appropriate in number 3, that animals shall be contained, and maybe that's a can of worms, because we have to define what appropriate is. In an appropriate building, coop, cage, or pen. The people who were here not too long ago who said their neighbor is throwing the chicken poop over their fence, and he's raising dogs in a
Camper.
closed trailer, with no supervision. I think we should say something about, the appropriateness of the container. for the
That's a
animals.
subjective element.
Yeah,
Right,
and I think
appropriate
the issue
is-
wasn't that they had the animals in the container, I think the issue was that they were taking the feces and,
Well, see, like.
But it was also the container and the dogs, I mean, so we have the word
Well, I think it's too
normal
close
in
to their
traffic,
line.
That's also subjective and.
yeah, it's too close to their line, that's the issue.
This gentleman had his hand up, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I had a question, as a board or a town, or do you mostly run into issues with the manure versus where the animals are located?
Most of the time, I think it's the odor that creates the problem.
Order of the flies.
Is that generally, like, I guess what I'm saying is, you know, the setback for manure versus where the animals are could be 2 separate things, and maybe kind of solve.
That's a good point.
Unless they don't pick up the manure, if they're
Well,
just
yeah.
doing
Mr.
basically
Chairman.
pasturing, you know, in which then the manure is deposited wherever they are. And
Mhm.
this speaks about depositing. But, go on.
That was just my question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just curious
Yeah,
what you
the
guys
next-
run
The
into.
big-
Number
the
4
biggest
talks
issue
about
seems to be the odor that
Yeah, odor and flies.
it generates.
And occasionally noise depending on the species. But people even complain about mowing cows.
Mhm.
You've run into that, I bet. In the
Bells.
past.
Along the
Bells.
same lines.
Bells,
just
bells, really?
Really?
Oh,
Existing farms very frequently have fences that run right along the road
Right.
and
Yep.
right along property lines. I sincerely hope that the planning board is not going to adopt anything that would require people to run new fences, because that is seriously expensive.
No, that I think falls into the concept that it's grandfathered in because it's there now. That's, you know, Chip, you should remember, you were on the planning board, every time we come up with an ordinance, it's for new properties, not for the existing ones. The existing ones are allowed where they're at.
I think when you are selling it at town meeting, that point needs to be
It
made
needs to be
repeatedly
made.
and
It
very
has to be made
clearly,
in the ordinance.
so that you don't have pitchforks and torches.
And I agree.
Version
It needs to be, needs to be very well understood
Yeah, I didn't
that
like
does
the
not apply
word.
to existing businesses.
The other suggestion I was gonna make is maybe suitable instead of appropriate.
Suitable is good.
Yeah.
I think that covers all kinds of things, like, you know, got 4 cows stuffed into a 10 by 12, you couldn't physically do it, but, you know,
Right, trying.
a totally unsuitable building that they're forced to cram into.
That's, that
You
would
gotta
be,
get them upstairs.
that would be the one argument that I have in the definition before we ever get into the various setbacks. No registration or permitting is required by the town. The town has no way to know what these buildings look like, or how many animals are out there, if we're not requiring you to come and register.
But again, this is just a, this is a family
Correct.
plot.
Yeah, this is
It's
not
like-
commercial.
It's like type 1 for home occupations. Now, if there are complaints,
Correct.
then town's in a position to go and,
all back.
right.
And say,
Yeah,
okay,
control
are you this,
officer.
are you this
Or you
far,
call-
did you deposit this?
Or you call the animal control officer and you say, my neighbor's got, 4 cows and a telephone booth, we have an issue, that's cruelty to animals.
I don't know, I have, and that's ASCP, but I really, I look at this and I go, I don't have any idea how to enforce this except for setbacks. Suitable.
Right, suitable setbacks.
And what is a suitable container, what is a suitable enclosure? What's the standards that we're gonna go by, just say suitable?
Well,
We're
what-
Very
gonna
low.
use
What are people
nebulous
doing now?
terms all over the place, so.
I'm just thinking of the code enforcement, I'm speaking from the code enforcement officer right now, because he's gotta go to court on this.
Well, if it borders on cruelty to animals, I mean, that would be an unsuitable,
Or if it's a fence that's patently
Right.
too short, or it's got holes in it,
Yeah.
On a roof over the
Yeah.
animal.
Yeah,
I think there are a few things like that, that if you add language like that, at least that'll keep those problems from existing.
If the
We'd
complaint is
have to
that,
be more, we have to be a little more specific. I think.
but if the complaint is that animals are leaving the family farm,
Well, that's
being a nuisance,
an easy one.
having a suitable fence would keep that in.
Suitable shelter.
And suitable can be defined by expert witnesses.
Right.
Who will tell you what you need to
We have
house
to get
whatever
that,
the
because-
animal is and how many there are. We've done cases like that all the time.
Right, but this
People tell you what you have to have
specifies that
fence
you
and a
can't
horse.
have them,
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not to the landowner's benefit to have animals out on the road or running through the neighborhood, because that's a financial investment for them. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a chicken or whether it's a horse, it's not to their advantage to not take care of the animal properly. And
Doesn't
there,
stop them.
I know there will, ever since I've been a child, I have rebelled against being ruled by the people who do it wrong. And every time we write an ordinance, because one person in town has an issue over whatever, and then everybody else has to fall under that umbrella, I see that as a problem. It's doing it backwards.
So are you
But
saying
that-
the word suitable is not suitable?
I think the word suitable is fine.
Okay.
But that is by definition, law itself. Law is aimed at correcting wrong behavior, not rewarding good behavior. It's aimed at punishing bad behavior. Otherwise, we would not have to have laws. Because if we were all the good neighbor that we're supposed to be, we wouldn't need to be telling people you can't do that, or you
But I
can't
think-
do
Because
something else.
politics
You have other-
is rewarding the bad behavior.
That's right, we keep
So-
electing them.
But we do have other resources, like if you believe that an animal is not being well kept, you could let the animal control officer, and the animal control officer can call Augusta, and they can get somebody down
But
there.
that's
if
just a
they
higher
have-
level of enforcement against bad behavior.
But why
Well,
not just
what I'm
put
just
people
saying,
on
that's why-
notice so that they know you're thinking about it and
Right,
they.
and why
less
regulate
likely-
everybody in town, because somebody may, there's always gonna be, you're gonna have the people that.
Oh, yeah, we
And I don't
came
think
up
we
with
need to
that tonight when we
regulate
talked
that.
about trips. You're always gonna have people that are gonna push the
Right.
boundaries, and most people are not going to do that.
But that's what I mean, I don't think we need to get it into it too much here, because you do have other avenues with animals
Mhm.
that, you know, to,
No, and
Take
this is,
care of
this
that.
is a family farm, and I think that if you have proper setbacks, you say that they have to be either in a building, coop, cage, pen, fencing, then that says you can't let them run amok. Then you can't deposit these things, it has to be this far from your boundaries and this far from a well. I think that's going to restrict some of the activities that people were complaining about. And in the same thing, if it passes and people are doing it, for some of this, if they're so far from, if they're this close to the well or this close to the line, then, you know, there's your enforcement. I'm not sure that you're gonna be doing as much enforcement on the buildings as you are gonna be on some of the activities. But I think that the limit is going to limit. So if you have 1 acre, you're not gonna be able to have 2 cows and a pig and, you know, 15 chickens, because you just don't have the area for it. If you wanna have that type of thing, you need to go find a bigger piece of property. But it also protects the neighbors, because you say you can't have them within this far.
And the question is, what's that distance?
What was
You know,
required.
if we don't tell them about the
25.
building and, you know, what kind, it's suitable or appropriate,
yeah.
cage, coop, whatever, how far back are we going to allow them, how far back are we going to allow the animals to be from the property line?
I'm thinking if your setbacks for your side yard setbacks are 25 feet from your property line, chances are your neighbor's house is not gonna be on your setback line. So you're talking probably another 50 feet altogether. I think if 25, just like a building setback, is more than, in a 1 acre
That
area.
daycare wasn't a 25-foot setback,
I don't know, yeah.
right?
The cable volcano, that one?
Very.
No, they had 100 beds, but.
They have
Right.
a huge,
They have
Yeah.
400.
But wasn't it part of their permit when they went in?
The setbacks? Yeah.
Over there?
Yeah, they're over there.
Yep.
Yeah. They
Okay,
had-
so if
It
you
had
have
to be
25
25, right?
Is that just for
No,
the rubber
no,
shows
they had to be,
Saturday?
they had to be at least
Mhm.
150, I think it was.
I'd be inclined to say 35 feet. Your normal 25 feet for buildings, and then you have that extra 10 feet as a buffer, so to speak. I think that would ease some nervousness.
I'm a little surprised coming from you, Donna.
I agree.
I struggle,
Every once in a while.
I think, I don't know, like I said, your building is gonna be 25 and their building's gonna be 25, so minimum, you know, 25.
I would be
Yeah,
good
I'll be right with
with
you.
that in the context of building, coop, cage, or pen. I struggle with fencing. Being that, you know, having that far away. And a lot of that's to Chip's point that we've had,
Mhm.
you know, fencing has historically been
That-
at or pretty damn
Right.
close to the
And you don't
property line.
regulate the, how far back? Do you set regular fences? Like if I wanna put a
No.
fence around my yard, do I
Right.
regulate
Well, you
that?
have to be off the property line,
It has to be off
but
the
it can be
property
2
line.
feet off the property.
Right, yeah.
So, well, I agree with Jamie, I think
Mhm.
fences should be excluded, but I still think the word suitable should be in there.
Well, we can just,
suitable or.
We can make two
appropriate.
different standards for
Right.
fencing
No, I
and
meant
for,
about
Yeah,
the
separate that out.
building,
Yep,
Yeah, so, no,
yeah.
Separate
you know, it could be
fencing, yeah.
suitable or appropriate, because you would not put cows in a chicken pen.
Right.
But they're in a
You
building.
could try, yeah.
It's a big chicken pen, what can I tell you? We have big chickens around here.
So did we decide on setbacks?
Not
Chip
yet.
is,
No.
Chip is done, okay.
Actually, Jamie addressed I was going to ask for a separate standard for fencing
Okay.
as opposed to
yeah, that's what I was
an
thinking.
enclosure, which somehow needs to include pig pens.
That's an enclosure.
As an enclosure as opposed to fencing. I have no idea how you write that. But
That would
I
fall
would
under the
suggest,
pens.
okay, but I would suggest, my suggestion was exactly what Jamie said.
Well, I'm not sure. what
So we
number
scrapped the word
have.
fencing and we stitch it in later on with its own setback.
It's actually.
Or can you break it apart here and say or other enclosures with a setback of so many feet from abutting properties or roads for
Fencing shall be,
buildings, coops, cages, or pens, and so many feet for fencing.
I think you need to, if I may, if you have a structure, you have to follow the code.
Right,
Period.
25, yeah.
So, we don't even have to say that, all we have to do is say structures have to meet the
Setbacks.
setbacks for the district they're in, period.
Right.
And then, because that's what the code enforcement office is looking at. So you're dealing with really fencing.
Is a bunny cage a structure?
Probably not, because it's,
I never got a permit, so.
It's portable.
Well, see, then we're right back to where we were before.
Exactly that.
That's why this is written this way.
well, you can't put a structure inside of the building setback to the district. You just can't do that.
All right, so it has to be at least 25 feet.
Well, in some districts it's more, in some districts it's
Well,
less.
But we're only doing R1.
Talking about R1 at the moment. But, all right.
well, no, wouldn't you want this to
So
be,
you
Yeah,
want,
wouldn't you want
then we-
family farms to be in every district?
Yes,
Yes.
but I didn't wanna go too far astray from what we've been talking about, which is specifically R1. So if we wanna make it for R1, R2, R3, then,
I would think that family farms, and the standard would be the same everywhere.
yeah, well,
This
yes,
is,
that
this
was,
is,
that's right.
Yeah.
this is what you're going to
yeah,
have.
that works.
And
Because
go,
then it
okay.
does what Dot was talking about before, and that is it naturally limits what can
Right.
take place on a 1 acre lot.
Correct.
So,
So,
Regardless of where the 1 acre lot is, even
That's
if it's in
right.
R3.
that's correct,
Yes.
so,
So essentially, animals shall be contained in a suitable building, coop, cage, pen, or other enclosures with a setback equivalent to the underlying,
District.
yeah.
district code,
Yeah.
yes.
then then fencing is off the table.
Right. Yeah, not including fencing.
No, because then you're gonna get into the issue where we discussed the other day, where they have the fencing up against the person's property and they're allowing the animals to go up.
But then at
But
the same
then
time.
it's limited in the next one.
Right.
So I don't think, you might not have to address it because
Right,
their waste and the fertilizer should not be deposited or stockpiled within setback of so many feet from the abutting properties, roads, or within feet of a well.
I mean, animals
That
have
will
roamed-
restrict where you put your fence.
Yeah, I mean, animals have roamed within feet of property lines for, since people came
Right.
over here.
and if you don't regulate my fence, because I'm just putting it up for decoration or for setbacks,
Yeah.
why are you regulating the animal fencing? You know, you shouldn't, the fencing is
You're not
fencing.
regulating the fencing,
We're
you're
regulating the animals.
I know, but I'm just,
Well,
but
you,
I would take offense in the fact that you didn't regulate his fence, but you're regulating my fence.
No, we're not regulating
That's
your
regulating
fence.
the use of the fence.
But I would contend that there's probably more, if I had a single cow, that I could have a neighbor with, 4 barking dogs that would be a bigger nuisance
Mhm.
than a single cow
Yep.
running right up to my property line.
Yes.
Barking at your cow.
Right,
Right.
right, the issue comes into play is when you're putting your stuff on somebody else's property,
oh, sure.
or the fertilizers and compost are too close to your well. And
That
I-
has
on
nothing
the
to do with the
property line.
fence.
On the property.
But is it,
If the
I'm
fence is on
looking
the
at
property
this,
line and my well is right on the, next to the property line, he could.
Yeah.
No, that could.
Yeah.
But that's not your stockpile, I mean, the fence is to.
Even, what if I have a dug well and your cow is roaming around and happens to deposit its
And it rains,
All
then
all
it's that
day, every day,
well.
I mean, it's that spot.
Right,
I-
depending on
You're
your
not gonna done it
land.
with your pooper
Right.
scooper, I don't think, to pick it up, but I don't, maybe they do, I don't know anything about animals.
I look at the fences and go.
We don't.
I know.
I look at fences
But
and
you're right,
I say,
Tom,
we're
usually,
not
a
right.
lot of people don't, when you're doing your farm like that, you're usually not going out with the poop.
I don't think so.
You're really not.
I was just gonna ask what kind of.
You're letting it
deposit is
fertilize your field.
deposited?
I was gonna ask that
Right.
one too.
Do you shovel it, do you put it there, or does it, do you the animal leave it there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The animal's well trained.
See, when it comes to a well, for me, it makes no difference whether the animal deposits it there or your nasty neighbor puts it over the fence and deposits it there. If it's too close to my well, that's not a good thing.
But what Tom is saying is his well could be on the other side of that fence.
Well,
And
then
the
you-
No, that's what I'm
animal may-
saying.
yeah.
Right, so she's saying then you can't put your fence
Okay.
to allow the animal to get within that certain.
Why,
That's
why
right,
can't we
your
just,
fence would have to be, if we said it has to be 100 feet from a well, then your fence is gonna be 100 feet away from your neighbor's well.
That's right.
Face reality, it's within 100 feet of any well, not just yours.
what are we trying to do with the word, with fence, with the idea of fencing? Because the number 4 speaks to the protection of wells and other, maybe other water bodies, but,
It's-
and
see,
then
I
and
don't-
3 speaks to enclosures.
Right.
I think we should just perhaps inject something in there about appropriate use of fences.
Well, I think the appropriate use of fences
But-
is to keep your animals on your property, not your neighbor's.
And it doesn't matter where the proximity of the fence.
Right.
I don't think it does.
No, I don't think it
So
does.
we just recite that there'll be suitable use of fencing to contain the animals, period. We don't have to talk about distances from boundary lines, because that's governed by 4, we're concerned about
Okay,
animal
so-
deposits.
Right.
Take
And
the
it-
fencing out of 3, put it in its own line, in its own category, and say
Right, make that number 4 and then,
fencing has to be appropriate for the use, but it would still be restricted from feet of the abutting property. You can't have any of these, you can't have a building coop, cage or pen within X feet of the abutting property, but then you can't have any waste, compost, or fertilizer shall not be deposited or stockpiled. So deposited means any way.
Dropped.
So you can't have your fencing within X feet of the abutting property or within X feet of the well.
And that would take, my complaint was the goats, you put them a tire, so it's not even a fence, you can just chain them to a tire, but they're right on the property line, and that would take
Right.
care of that, because.
So you need an asterisk about deposit,
We don't
which
do
means
asterisks, we
any
put it in
kind
there.
of deposit.
No, we don't, we say it out.
Manually
You don't put
placed
asterisks.
or
50 feet
placed
from the
by
property
nature.
line.
It is meant to be any deposit.
Yes.
That's what.
Right.
That's the
well
way I
meant
read it
to be.
immediately.
Yes.
But is that,
In place, defending in place.
I mean, when I think of something you're trying to protect from a well, I mean, it's more of the stockpile of a large quantity and
Oh,
concentration.
no, no.
Okay,
You don't want, I don't even fertilize my lawn,
okay,
because anything that I put on my lawn, when it rains, is gonna run down or come in and go into my well. I am very protective of both of my wells. I don't put anything near them. We restrict what we use for fertilizers, we don't put anything near the wells, because wells by nature go like this. So anything around it goes like this down into your well. So if somebody's too close to your well and you have either manure or fertilizer or chicken, whatever, when it rains, that all floats and it's gonna end up in your well. I would prefer not to have somebody's E. coli or feces in my well. It's bad enough I have it in every stream on my property now because of somebody's pollution.
We
but
cleaned
let's-
up a while back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
We actually ran into this with our well and a state inspector. We have a regulation that we follow for grazing animals, which is 75 feet. And I don't know if maybe something would be different for like a chicken or something, which isn't gonna drop a cow patty, you know.
I mean, that was my
but-
thought, is you could have some smaller animals that aren't as intensive.
Yeah, exactly. So
Right.
for us cows, it's 75 feet, and with the fencing, it's whatever is appropriate to contain the animal. So, I mean, a cow, it's not a 2-foot chicken fence, so that might
Yeah, that's a good.
help with
point.
Well,
this.
yeah, and you could put up a split rail fence to stop a cow, but it's not gonna help you with a chicken at all.
Exactly.
Shut
So
it down.
I don't have any issue with keeping animals and animal waste away from wells, but I wanna reiterate that fencing along property lines or along roads as long as you're not impinging on somebody's water quality, I think is overly restrictive.
No, and I think that's why we were gonna break out the fencing
Hmm.
and put fencing,
But my suggestion is the limitation on fencing be wells, period, not property lines.
Well, we
Yeah.
just assert the appropriate use of fencing for and containment of the animal, period, isn't it?
Well,
That's all it
and
is.
to
Right.
ensure the animals don't get closer than X feet from a well, and I don't, 75 feet seems like.
isn't that what I,
That's what the
Yeah,
state
that's
says.
what I
Well,
asked
mean,
you.
if the state says 75 foot from a well, then,
That's what it should be.
That's what it was for us for grazing. I don't know what it is for like intensive storage or anything like that.
It's
but-
more than that for
Well, no, it's
intensive
much more-
storage.
Right,
well,
is
no,
that
no, I mean, but we're not talking about intensive
Exactly.
storage. I'm suggesting fencing is one thing and storage or, what's the stockpiling, whatever, the composting. I'd be happy if that's 150 feet. I don't know what the right number is, but it seems to, a grazing animal, I don't see any problem with it being right up next to a road. I fully admit that I have a non-objective viewpoint. But I'm just suggesting that maybe the limitation, you have one setback from a well for the fencing, and a second, more restrictive setback for any kind of composting, stockpiling,
no, and
whatever.
I think that's where I was going when I asked to break out the fencing.
Yeah, okay,
Right, and so the fencing on the lot, around the lot doesn't bother me, as long as the fencing next to the well is at the appropriate distance.
How about this, fencing appropriate to contain animals may not be closer than whatever number of feet from any well. Which means you can put it any place you want, as long as it's not closer than whatever we decide on to a well.
I wanna come at you with a stinky billy goat. I'm just looking at the worst case, 1 acre lot. I didn't wanna live in a 1 acre lot to have a stinky billy goat next to me. I wanted to enjoy my backyard, going in the barbecue, and I didn't want the flies.
You can't have it, because he's gonna make a deposit. If he's making a deposit, he can't be within,
So that's still on the table for a deposit.
yeah,
By a well or a setback or boundary line?
Right now it's a well.
from,
Yeah.
Right now, it's well.
from the well
Or
or,
abutting property.
or the abutting property.
Yeah, you can have the fence on for,
I lost the abutting property.
still there.
I stepped on the rock.
So again, I
Well,
mean,
then,
if you're taking
then we
any
lose
kind
the
of
street.
deposit, you know, why not just put the setback for the fence like you would for a building, or even more restricted?
How about a setback from the building, from an adjacent building, a residential building? Because that's what we're really talking
No.
about, right?
Because the person who owns that property owns up to the line.
I'm talking about the adjacent property, not.
No,
Yeah,
my patio.
that's what I'm talking about.
my swimming pool and my patio.
Okay.
I don't, I love the animals, I've raised them all my life, I grew up on a farm. I just feel we need to look at it in every aspect.
No, that person, you have two people that live next door to each other. So, I live here, and the goat lives here. These are the two lots. This person should not be able to get too close to my lot, my line, because I should be able to enjoy every piece of my property. They should be able to deposit here if I'm cooking out here or wanna put a swimming pool. So this is mine, this is yours, you have to stay within your boundaries. Fencing, I don't have an issue with, but if they're gonna make any deposits or the animal's gonna be there, they can't be next to this line. There has to be a setback from that line.
And I would say
Well-
that that setback needs to be fenced off to prevent the animals from getting closer to the line. Cause if you've got a completely clear lot, then animals can walk right across onto your property. So you'd have to have a fence or some way to prevent that animal from coming over.
Do you have any nuisance ordinances for odor or?
That's so hard to.
It's very hard to enforce.
And what if I were to say, well, the topography, Diane's lot runs down onto my lot, so there's no risk of anything that my animal deposits on my lot running onto hers, why can't I have the fence right at the property line?
Because it's not, according to this is not registered or permitted, the town doesn't know anything about any of that. We don't know where the property lines are, what the fences are gonna look like, what kind of animals are gonna be there, how close they're gonna get to each other. We don't have any of that information, and we're never gonna have it, because it's not, it doesn't require a permit. If it required a permit, we'd know that information, and we could make that as a judgment call and a decision. But based on this, we're not gonna know it, so we don't know what
Unless
it's
it's a
about.
building permit, I mean, that, you know, something that small, but, yeah, we'll never know about this stuff.
Well-
We won't be able to enforce this until the problem exists. And that's from
That's the problem.
day-to-day behavior, day-to-day situations. We don't know until it happens. And then we come out and go, wow, what the heck, how did this happen?
I'm more worried about what's gonna happen when Diane's goats and chickens walk up to Jamie's property line, cause he's downhill from it.
But,
Jim, oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, well, I'll be fast, but to Dot's point, layout, there is a legal definition according to our town attorney, and I'm sure Tom will concur, or I'm reasonably certain that he will concur, that, that there is a legal definition for the word nuisance. And I think odor is a big thing, odor and noise.
But it's very costly to get that through the court
No.
systems.
Well, what I'm saying is, I think that just by saying it also is a deterrent to a certain level of perpetrator, offender, or whatever. You don't think it is, Ted, so you're shaking your head.
Well, no,
But-
I'm only saying because there are those who would disagree. And, you know, when we talk about this thing, I'm remembering all the nightmares we've had, that's all. You know, as Dot is, Dot's remembering her nightmares.
On the odor, you know, I mean, I lived out in Dayton, there was a couple of farms near me, and, you know, they had like 100 dairy cattle, and I had no problems, I, you know, got along really well with them. And I understood, in the springtime, they were going to spread manure, and it smelled for a day or so, and, you know, you live with it, but some people actually move out in the country, we've had that happen here, where they move out in the country next to a farm, and then they come in and complain because the farm spreads manure and it smells and blah, blah, and you go, you know, we live in the country, and, you know, I think, you know, it's hard to define in a rural area when you have like,
But those
Things like
seem
that.
benign to me. I mean, when I first bought my property and was gonna build my house, someone said to me about, you know, it was a veiled threat that he would park pigs, behind me on the part of the land that mine abutted to his, and he would be sure that, that I would know that they were there, and I know that there are, I don't know what you would, ordinances about, you know, nuisances and punitive kind of activities from one neighbor to the other. And so, you know, I think you could get a neighbor on a 1 acre lot that really wants to be a horse's ass and does things, and, you know, it reeks or it's incredibly noisy and you can't sleep and whatever. I mean,
And if you don't
Fortunately-
have the money to fight them,
well, but that's all, I mean, you know, unfortunately, that happens a lot. I mean, a lot of people, they wait you out if they have more funds than you do and you can't fight them. In fact, there's somebody very well known that we all know that was his practice in business. He could pay the lawyers, and a lot of the people that wanted to fight him couldn't, and so they had to acquiesce. So unfortunately, that's just a fact of life. But I'm saying, I think nuisance is worthwhile. I know there are nuisance laws anyway about
But
doing things
Those
just to be a pain
becomes,
in the.
those are civil issues. As we found
Right.
out last week with, or 2 weeks ago with the issue of throwing chicken coop over the fence, that's a civil issue, that's nothing that the town can address. And most nuisances are pretty much the same way. You know, there's, you've gotta have so much proof and be able to document, you're better off just going to the judge and trying to get some kind of a restraining order and hope that they violate the restraining order.
And, yeah,
I would like to offer a compromise.
I'm not sure what
yeah,
What we're
maybe
looking
it's
at
my,
in
maybe
terms-
my comment is
because
not
I've lost
appropriate.
what we were working on. I thought we were talking about, distances
Yes.
for either buildings or
Deposits.
deposits from wells.
That's where I'd like to go.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Chip makes an excellent point in terms of traditional farming and fences as boundaries to property lines, and you have your 10 acres out back and the cows wandering around, hopefully staying within the fence. This, as the backyard family farm, and it says right at the top specifically residential districts, so potentially smaller lots and not serious level farming. I think there should be a setback even for the fence, and I view it as a good neighbor policy. That I have a relatively small piece of land, you have a relatively small piece of land, we are therefore relatively close to each other. If I observe this extra setback to keep my animals' waste or odor away from you that extra distance, that I'm doing that as a courtesy. So I get to have my animals and you get to enjoy your pool. Now, going back just to the deposits. Having the animal right up to the property line and making an occasional deposit, basically, I don't think is gonna bother anybody anytime. However, if it's a goat, the goat doesn't need to make a deposit. The goat smells like a goat, and he smells seriously like a goat. So, honest,
Billy
Does it smell
Will-
worse than pigs?
we'll talk.
Okay.
Billy goat, oh, absolutely.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Billy goat has a very distinctive odor, which you don't forget once you know it. Now, whether you can live with it or not is up to you. If it's not your goat, it could be annoying.
Right.
So that extra step that this landowner is going to go through, to be putting his fence back away from the property line, is the good faith gesture that you can see my goat, and you can come and visit my goat, but hopefully you don't smell my goat. Or my pig, or my chicken, whatever it is. So that's the reason I would advocate for the setback. Which shouldn't impact somebody who's doing what Chip is doing with his land. Or you guys are doing with your land.
This is for family farms.
Yes.
We have to keep reminding ourselves.
Yes.
This is something where
Small.
right now, the only regulation is you can't have more than 5 animal units. You can't have more than 5,000 pounds of animal out there. That's the regulation right now. So this is actually, in some ways, although it doesn't limit the numbers, what it does is it does provide some performance standards that don't exist right now.
It limits the impact.
It limits the impact.
6 feet.
How far would the goat have to be, the smelly billy goat tied
Billy
to
goat,
the
I
tire?
want
have
to be
to
on my
be-
1 acres.
Well, I mean, see, I'm asking a serious question,
No.
and I think you've identified a particular animal that's like the guinea hen is to
Mhm.
chickens, goats are to domesticated
Billy goat,
animals.
regular goat's not, it's billy.
Cause I've met all kinds of goats, and I've never met one that had a just horrific smell. How far would,
On a really humid summer day, I'm telling you, mild. But I
Well, no, I
really don't, Chip, and it's really hard. 'cause
I guess where I'm heading is, I understand what Donna's saying about the good faith, and I understand your problem, but let's throw out a number, 25 feet
25,
is not gonna make any difference, is it?
no,
Well,
Well, for small lots, I mean, that's a big chunk,
that's it, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
too big, too much.
And I think that's where
Well-
I'm getting hung up, is it you're talking about an overlay, Jamie, that it's, if 2, 3 acres, you know, it's 1 acre, and it can really impact if you're 1 acre, 1 acre, 1 acre.
Oh, I agree. I mean,
I don't know, because, you know, anything other than a billy goat and pigs, it isn't so detrimental to have that fence. It's just, I feel that we have to look at it all the sides, that some people don't know, they're kinda stupid, or some people are vindictive, and they might
Yeah.
just.
And still, I think that falls within the whole, you know, within the, not adversely affect the residential character of the neighborhood.
You know, we are
You
talking
can
about.
have fences,
neighbors.
fine, you get a smelly billy goat, all of a sudden that's brought in, and now, even if it stays within, or outside of the 25 feet on its side, you're still smelling it on the complete other side of your property. That's adversely affecting the neighborhood. And then that's why I think that falls in.
But I think if you give the same setbacks to the animals as you do for the house, there's a reason why there's setbacks for the house. That is because you want it away from other neighbors, you want it away from the property lines. I think the animals ought to be the same way, they ought to have the same setbacks.
But I think if you're going to have setbacks, the animals, no disrespect to stupid animals, but they're all stupid, they don't know that they can't go more than 25 feet to that property line. They're gonna go down and they're gonna cross the line. And I think because they're gonna go down and they're gonna cross the line, you need to put a fence up. It needs to be an appropriate fence that is going to stop chickens, if that's what you have, or cows, if that's what you have. But I think if you're gonna have a family farm, you need to put a fence up. And if we decide that it's 25 feet from the property line, then it's 25 feet from the property line. If you wanna have a farm, you have to meet certain standards and certain conditions. The same way that Luke had to meet certain standards and conditions to have their farm out on 111. You've got standards that you have to meet. Chip?
I'd make one comment. The setbacks, side setbacks, back setbacks, front setbacks, are greater in the districts with larger lot sizes.
It might be.
Well, but that's counterintuitive to me when you're talking about R1. I think using the setbacks just applying the setbacks for R1, R2, R3 for the buildings is fine. But to me, the setback for fencing shouldn't be greater in R3 than it is in R1. Maybe it should be the other way around.
Yeah.
That if in R1, maybe it should be 50 foot, whereas, because you got 1 acre zoning, but in R3 with 2 acre zoning, maybe 25 foot would be adequate.
And, that's
But
a valid argument. I'm simply saying that you need a fence at that setback line, because you don't want animals crossing.
No, I agree with you, I'm just saying, I think putting the fence at the existing setbacks for buildings doesn't, it seems backwards to me.
Well, I was only talking about one.
25 feet regardless of what district you're in.
Yes, I think so.
You know, whatever the setback is, we decide, it's the same for, it's a setback for the animals, and it really has nothing to do with the zone you're in. It should be the same, across the board.
Yeah, and we could do that. We could say that, it's a setback of 25 feet from the property line. But regardless of the zone, if you've got a family farm, that's your setback, it's 25 feet, and that's where your fence has to go.
Keep in mind, folks, this is a definition. All right, that's all, this is gonna tell you whether you're a family farm or not. This isn't a performance standard right
That's
here.
true.
Well, then we can get rid of,
No, you need this for the definition, I agree, I mean, but this is just a definition, so, and you're gonna have this under permitted use in R1 and probably other zones as well.
but what I'm saying would be the conditions, would be the setback.
Right, you have to meet all these conditions to meet that definition,
Yes.
and that, then
Yes.
you're permitted,
Yep.
okay?
Big definition.
It's a long one.
It's a long definition section. Unless we put for performance standards, but that's gonna mess up things.
No,
That's
I think
a
it's,
family farm.
I mean, I think it works pretty well, you got farm, and then you got family farm, and you got a,
Yeah.
I don't know, commercial farm or whatever it's called, I think.
Well, the commercial farm will be in the farm overlay district.
Right.
That we look at and say, you know, and we'll have,
I gotta talk about that, I'm not sure
Yeah,
I
not
understand that, but we
Yeah.
can do all that another
I
time.
was
don't
saying,
know
I
why
don't
we
know
need
if I
that.
understand overlaying.
Next meeting.
I think, yeah.
And speaking,
next meeting.
and
But I
speaking
think,
of
I think
overtime,
25,
time.
I think
I
25 feet from the road or from the
No, I
abutter is
don't know.
probably, I could live with that, I mean, not with the, but.
Right, and I could even live with less than that, other than a pig and a bingo. And that's being really selective.
And it's hard to say, I mean, remember Jean Labarge had this huge pig for years in her barn? Most people didn't even know she had it there, and it didn't bother any of the neighbors around, and, you know, it was a pet pig that she.
Right, but it was in her barn, so
It was in her barn,
Right,
but,
re-
yeah.
realistically, with goats, just to
Yeah,
maybe.
Billy goat.
Yeah, but if you have a family farm of this, small scale, if you're going to keep a goat, odds are you're not gonna keep a billy goat, you'll keep a female.
and I
And have her bred.
completely agree,
So,
except, again,
As a
you know,
pet, they do.
right,
nobody keeps a billy goat.
no, and it really is just for breeding, and then that would jump into
Service
probably a commercial.
There's a reason.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
He's just got the one?
This one probably did have different ones, so they bred them in there.
Okay, so we've got a bunch of stuff to think about.
Hey, really?
We're gonna, it'll be 3 weeks, 3 weeks? No, it'll be the 21st before we get together again, so yeah, it'll be 3 weeks. So, well, the next time we get together, let's think about the setbacks and the kinds of,
I think it should be 25 and 100. 25 from the,
unless you wanna say it's
Whatever, and
2,500, we can go
and
with that.
100
That's-
from the well, because that's what your
Well.
septic has to be 100 feet from your well.
Then
Then they shouldn't be able to deposit anything within 100 feet of your well.
You could use that septic setback for, storage.
Right, the concentrated.
We're
I mean, I
storing,
struggle
yeah.
with that.
I
mean, we-
From,
From, I mean, animals go all over the place, in the woods, in the yard, wherever, you know, within 100 feet of a well. Now, I'm not saying that that should be a concentrated deposit in any way. And I think, like Lucas said, especially with larger animals, you may want more protection. But, you know, chickens roaming around in a yard within, 50 feet of a well, is that really that detrimental? I don't know.
Well, probably
Yeah,
not
and I
if it's a small number of chickens.
But, and that's what a family farm would infer.
Exactly. And I mean, none of us have control over all the stuff that wanders through our yard and brings us stuff in
Turkeys
the
and-
middle of the night and we don't even
Exactly.
know.
That's right.
Exactly.
Right, so I think that's a good distinction to split that up.
that'll give us some stuff to think
Yeah.
about before we get together again.
So I have one thing, can we take the language from Donna's number 5, that shall not create greater traffic than is customary for the area, and put that where we have the word normal on our trip charges,
It says
number
that.
of trips? We
It's
have
actually-
normal,
That's what
I
it's.
think Donna changed
I
that.
think I did, yes.
so it no
Same
longer
one.
says
It's not
normal.
normal.
No, cause you suggested
Customary.
customary last time, we all agreed
Yeah,
that was a much
so
better
this
word.
now goes back into the home occupation?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I stole your word. and
Oh, I
used it
like
here.
that, so I like that better than normal.
There you go. That's right,
For
cause
the rare times
normal,
I've,
who knows for how long.
So it's in the record that you're against normalcy?
Okay.
I am definitely against
All
normal.
right.
Hang on.
One question, are we all set with the list of permitted and conditional uses in this district? With the exception of animal husbandry, issues, family farm and stuff like that. Is everything else all set?
I think
I think
we're
think we've been
lined
through
up.
it.
Yeah.
Okay, cause I wasn't sure, after the last meeting, I had a kind of a feeling we were gonna go back,
Oh, no,
You may
always
be adding
moving
some
forward.
Huh?
No.
You may be adding some things.
No, I
That's
think
fine.
we,
But
Family
I-
farm may be added.
Family farms,
Yeah.
probably gonna be added,
Mm.
but I just wanted to get that buttoned up.
no, I think the ones that we put and took out, I think,
Yeah, I think we
Okay.
do that.
So I wanna get that out to you.
I feel all
So
right
I have-
with that. We spent a lot of time going through that.
Okay,
I
good,
miss
thanks.
those,
That's what I wanted.
yeah, I miss those meetings, so I
Actually,
have
it
no
was
idea.
very helpful.
We will,
What you did was very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, because it,
Yeah.
wow, you know, really.
Give us a place to start.
Launching.
I totally agree.
So would you like the motion?
Discussion.
Yep. we, don't forget, we're meeting on the 21st, February,
February.
7 PM.
Aren't
We
we
have-
meeting on Valentine's Day also?
No, that's the
The
planning board.
planning
Planning
board?
board's meeting.
That's the planning. So we have next week off.
One-
Next 2 weeks.
Oh, I
We get
love
one
it.
week
We
off.
have a meeting on the 14th.
Amazing. So thank you.
Make the motion.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn for this evening.
I'll second.
Motion's been made and seconded to adjourn. Thank you very much for coming.
Who did the motion?
Second.
That's okay.
I've made a motion.
Does not require a vote.
Doing better?
Yeah. I'm
Look at
on
that.
the edge, yeah.
Yeah.
Like some days I feel better and then some days I feel like.
The water down. And then we have a nice,
Thank you. Good, all you see you.
Yeah, because what time do you think this is home? And I was like, well, the last joint meeting, it was 9 o'clock and people were turning into pumpkins. And we couldn't get out here fast enough. No, actually, well, I think
She
just
reduces
discussion.
very well.
I
She does, I was impressed.